In the heart of America, behind white picket fences and manicured lawns, darkness can lurk in the most unexpected places. Tonight I'm going to tell you a story so disturbing, so unthinkable, that it will challenge everything you believe about family, love, and the human capacity for evil. This is the story of Brandon and Ashley Hartwell, two teenagers who grew up in privilege, wanted for nothing, and yet committed an act so heinous that it would send shockwaves across the entire nation. This is the story of how greed, manipulation, and cold-blooded calculation led to the brutal murder of Thomas and Linda Hartwell in their own home. This is the story of a trial that captivated America and forced us to ask ourselves, how could children do this to their own parents? This is Dark Echoes Crime, and for the next several hours, I'm going to take you deep into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern American history. We'll examine the evidence, hear from witnesses, explore the psychology behind these horrific acts, and ultimately, try to understand how something like this could happen in a quiet town in suburban Connecticut. But I warn you, this story contains graphic details of violence, disturbing psychological elements, and themes that may be difficult for some listeners. If you're sensitive to discussions of familial violence or murder, you may want to turn back now. Still with me? Then let's begin. Springfield Oaks, Connecticut. Population, 23,456. Median household income, $187,000. Crime rate, practically non-existent. The kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where kids ride bikes without supervision, where the biggest scandal is usually about who didn't trim their hedges to HOA standards. It's September 2019, and if you were to drive down Maple Ridge Drive, past the brick colonials and the stone facade McMansions, you'd eventually come to number 847, a stunning 6-bedroom, 5-bathroom estate sitting on 2 acres of impeccably landscaped property. The house is valued at $2.3 million. The 3-car garage houses a Mercedes, a BMW, and a restored 1967 Mustang. This is the Hartwell residence. From the outside, everything about this home screams success. The kind of success that generations dream about. And the people who lived inside? They seem to embody the American dream itself. Thomas Hartwell, age 52. Self-made millionaire. Started with nothing. Grew up in a trailer park in rural Pennsylvania, put himself through community college, worked 3 jobs while getting his business degree at night. By 35, he'd built a commercial real estate empire worth over $15 million. By 50, that number had nearly tripled. But here's the thing about Thomas that everyone who knew him will tell you. He never forgot where he came from. He donated generously to scholarship funds. He mentored young entrepreneurs. He volunteered at homeless shelters every Thanksgiving. His business partners described him as tough but fair. His employees loved him. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely good man who had worked his ass off for everything he had. And then there was Linda. Linda Hartwell, age 49. If Thomas was the ambition, Linda was the heart. She'd met Thomas in college. She was getting her degree in early childhood education. They married young at 23 and 24 respectively. She taught kindergarten for 15 years before retiring to focus on raising their children and managing the household. But Linda didn't just manage the household. She was the glue that held that family together. She organized charity drives at the local church. She baked cookies for school functions. She was room mom, soccer mom, dance mom, she did it all. Her friends describe her as warm, generous, maybe a little too trusting. The kind of person who saw the best in everyone. Linda had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world when she talked to you. One of her closest friends, Rebecca Tolliver, would later testify. She was just pure goodness. I know that sounds corny, but it's true. She didn't have a malicious bone in her body. Thomas and Linda had 2 children, Brandon and Ashley. Brandon Hartwell. Born June 15, 2001. 18 years old at the time of the murders. Tall, about 6 feet 2 inches, athletic build from years of playing varsity lacrosse. Dark hair, blue eyes, the kind of conventionally handsome that made him popular with his peers. Honor roll student at Springfield Oaks Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in Connecticut. SAT score, 1480. Already accepted early decision to Cornell University with plans to study business, just like his dad. On paper, Brandon was perfect. Ashley Hartwell. Born March 3, 2003. 16 years old. Petite, blonde, blue-eyed like her brother. Cheerleader, student council representative, lead in the school musical. GPA, 4.0. The kind of girl who had colleges already courting her even as a sophomore. Volunteers at an animal shelter. Posts inspirational quotes on Instagram. Has over 3,000 followers who see her as the epitome of teen success. On paper, Ashley was perfect too. Together, the Hartwells were what every family aspired to be. They took vacations to Europe. They had family game nights. They attended church together every Sunday. Their Christmas card photos were the kind that made other families jealous. I'm looking at one of those photos right now. Christmas 2018. Less than a year before the murders. Thomas has his arm around Linda. Brandon and Ashley are in front, all smiles. Everyone's wearing matching cream-colored sweaters. The fireplace is decorated behind them. They look happy. Genuinely happy. This photo would later be entered as evidence in the trial. It would be blown up on a screen in the courtroom while prosecutors asked the jury a simple question. Does this look like a family on the brink of violence? Does this look like children who are planning to murder their parents? Because here's the thing about monsters. They don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like honor students and cheerleaders. Sometimes they smile for Christmas photos while planning unspeakable acts. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight and no one suspects a thing. Not even their own parents. But let's rewind a bit. Because no one wakes up one day and decides to murder their parents. There's always a progression. Always warning signs. The question is, did anyone see them? According to friends and family, the first real cracks in the Hartwell family dynamic appeared around 2017, when Brandon was 16 and Ashley was 14. Sarah Mitchell was Brandon's girlfriend during his junior year. They dated for about 8 months before breaking up in the spring of 2018. When she was interviewed by police after the murders, she provided some disturbing insights into Brandon's relationship with his parents. Brandon had this, "I don't know, this resentment," Sarah told detectives. The interview was recorded and portions of it were played during the trial. Her voice is young, uncertain, scared. He would complain about his dad constantly. Said his dad was controlling. That he had all these expectations Brandon couldn't live up to. That nothing he did was ever good enough. Now let's be real for a second. Teenage angst toward parents is normal. Feeling like your parents don't understand you? That's basically a rite of passage. But according to Sarah, Brandon's complaints went deeper than typical teenage rebellion. He told me once that he hated his father, Sarah continued. Like really hated him. He said that his dad cared more about the family image than about him as a person. That everything was about maintaining appearances and building the family legacy. He felt like he was just a prop in his dad's success story. When prosecutors pressed Sarah on this, asking if she'd ever witnessed Thomas Hartwell being cruel or abusive toward Brandon, she admitted she hadn't. Every interaction she'd observed between father and son seemed normal, even loving. That's what was so weird about it, Sarah said. Mr. Hartwell was always nice to Brandon when I was around. He'd ask about school, about lacrosse, about our plans. He seemed like a good dad. But Brandon would get so angry about him when we were alone. Thomas's business partner, Michael Reynolds, provided additional context during his testimony. He'd known Thomas for over 20 years and he'd watched Brandon grow up. Look, Thomas had high standards, Reynolds testified. For himself, for his business, for his family. Was he a perfectionist? Absolutely. Did he push Brandon hard? Yeah, he did. But it came from love. Thomas wanted Brandon to be successful, to not have to struggle the way he did growing up. Reynolds leaned forward during his testimony, emotional. Thomas told me once that the greatest gift he could give his kids was teaching them the value of hard work and discipline. He didn't want them to be spoiled rich kids who coasted on daddy's money. He wanted them to earn their success. But here's where it gets complicated. Because teaching kids discipline and having unreasonable expectations are sometimes separated by a very thin line. Brandon's lacrosse coach, Derek Patterson, testified that Thomas attended every single one of Brandon's games. But his presence wasn't always positive. Thomas could be intense, Patterson said carefully. If Brandon made a mistake on the field, you could see Thomas getting frustrated in the stands. A couple of times I saw them arguing in the parking lot after games. Brandon would be upset and Thomas would be, I don't want to say angry, but definitely not happy. Patterson described one incident in particular that stuck with him. It was March 2019, about 5 months before the murders. Brandon had a particularly rough game, missed several shots, got beat on defense a few times. Afterward, Patterson saw Thomas and Brandon in what appeared to be a heated discussion. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Brandon looked like he was about to cry. And Thomas was pointing his finger, like really laying into him. It bothered me enough that I almost went over there, but Linda stepped in and seemed to calm things down. Now, does any of this justify what happened? Absolutely not. But the defense would later argue that Brandon had been living under years of intense psychological pressure. That Thomas Hartwell, despite his success and generosity toward others, had created an environment of impossible expectations for his son. Brandon Hartwell was drowning, defense attorney Marcus Holbrook would argue during opening statements. Drowning under the weight of his father's ambitions. Drowning in a sea of expectations that no teenager could possibly meet. And when you're drowning, sometimes you lash out in desperation. But what about Ashley? Where was she in all of this? Ashley's trajectory was different from her brother's, but no less troubling. While Brandon was the athlete under pressure, Ashley was the perfect daughter, at least on the surface. Her best friend, Melissa Kowalski, testified that Ashley had always been a perfectionist. Ashley stressed about everything, Melissa said. Her grades, her appearance, her social media presence. She would have panic attacks if she got an A- instead of an A. Her mom was always really supportive, but Ashley put so much pressure on herself. But there was something else going on with Ashley, something that wouldn't become clear until after the murders, when police examined her social media accounts and internet history. Ashley Hartwell had been spending time in some very dark corners of the internet. Detective Lisa Morrison was the cybercrime specialist assigned to the case. What she found on Ashley's devices was disturbing. Ashley had been visiting forums dedicated to true crime, Detective Morrison testified. Not unusual in itself, lots of people are interested in true crime. But she wasn't just a casual observer. She was actively participating in discussions about murder techniques, about how killers got caught, about forensic investigation methods. Ashley's browsing history showed searches for phrases like, how to commit the perfect murder, untraceable poisons, staging crime scenes, and, most chillingly, inheriting money as a minor, and emancipated minors and estate law. These searches dated back to January 2019, 8 months before the murders. But perhaps the most damning evidence of premeditation came from Ashley's encrypted messaging app. She'd been communicating with someone using the handle darkangel_13. Someone who investigators would later discover was actually Brandon using a burner phone. The messages between them started innocuously enough. Complaints about their parents. Typical sibling venting. But over time the tone changed. February 14, 2019. Valentine's Day. Ashley to Brandon, sometimes I wish they would just disappear. Like, imagine how much easier life would be. February 28, 2019. Brandon to Ashley, easier and a lot richer. We'd never have to worry about money again. March 15, 2019. Ashley to Brandon, do you ever think about it seriously? Like actually doing something? March 15, 2019. Brandon to Ashley, all the time. These messages would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. They demonstrated not just intent, but careful planning. A progression from fantasy to serious consideration to active plotting. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the planning and execution of the murders, we need to understand one more crucial element: the money. Let's talk about Thomas Hartwell's estate. Because money, or more specifically, the promise of money, was the gasoline that fueled this entire nightmare. Thomas Hartwell was worth approximately $42 million at the time of his death. His assets included commercial real estate holdings valued at $28 million, investment portfolios worth $8 million, the family home and other properties worth $4.50 million, cash, vehicles, and other assets totaling roughly $1.5 million. His will, drafted in 2015 and updated in early 2018, was remarkably straightforward. In the event of his death, Linda would inherit everything. Upon Linda's death, everything would be split equally between Brandon and Ashley. The children would gain full access to their inheritance at age 25. Until then, the estate would be managed by trustees who would provide for the children's needs and education, but would maintain control of the principal amount. That last part is crucial. Age 25. Brandon was 18 at the time of the murders. Ashley was 16. If their parents died, they would technically inherit millions, but they wouldn't actually control that money for years. Brandon wouldn't get full access until 2008. Ashley wouldn't get it until 2028. Unless they could find a way around it. Stephen Berkowitz was the estate planning attorney who had worked with Thomas for over a decade. His testimony provided critical insight into Thomas's thinking. Thomas was adamant about the age restriction, Berkowitz testified. He'd seen too many wealthy families ruined by kids who inherited too much too soon. He wanted Brandon and Ashley to finish college, to establish themselves professionally, to mature before they had access to serious money. Berkowitz continued. He told me, "Steve, I love my kids more than anything, but handing an 18-year-old millions of dollars is a recipe for disaster. I want them to earn their way first, just like I did." The prosecution argued that this age restriction was the key to understanding why the murders happened when they did. Brandon was 18, about to head off to Cornell. Ashley was 16, still in high school. Both were at ages where they were beginning to crave independence but were still under their parents' control. Thomas and Linda Hartwell loved their children, prosecutor Janet Silverman would argue. They wanted to protect them, to ensure they grew into responsible adults before inheriting wealth. But to Brandon and Ashley, that will represented something else entirely, an obstacle. 7 years of waiting. 7 years of being controlled. 7 years before they could live life on their terms. But there was another element to the financial picture that wouldn't come to light until the trial: Brandon's gambling problem. Marcus Cheng, a student at Springfield Oaks Academy who testified under immunity, revealed that Brandon had been involved in illegal online gambling since his junior year. He started small, betting on sports games, Cheng testified. But it escalated quickly. By senior year he was playing online poker regularly. Real money. Sometimes hundreds of dollars a hand. And he was losing. According to financial records subpoenaed during the investigation, Brandon had racked up nearly $47,000 in gambling debt by the summer of 2019. He'd been using credit cards his father had given him for emergencies, thinking he could pay them off before his dad noticed. He was wrong. In July 2019, just 2 months before the murders, Thomas discovered the charges. According to Brandon's ex-girlfriend Sarah, Thomas was furious. "Brandon told me his dad threatened to cut him off completely," Sarah testified. "Said he might not pay for Cornell. That Brandon needed to learn there were consequences for his actions. Brandon was terrified. He said his whole future was falling apart." Thomas and Linda had apparently agreed to give Brandon one chance. He could still go to Cornell, but he'd have to get a job to help pay for expenses. The credit cards were canceled. His allowance was cut off. And Thomas was going to make Brandon pay back every penny of that $47,000 over time. For a kid who'd never faced real financial consequences before, this was devastating. But here's what makes this truly tragic. Thomas was trying to teach his son a lesson about responsibility. He was trying to help Brandon in his own tough love way. He had no idea that his son had already started down a much darker path. A path that would lead to Thomas and Linda's brutal murders just weeks later. Ashley's financial motivations were different but equally compelling. According to her online activity, she'd become obsessed with influencer culture, specifically with lifestyle influencers who showcased luxury lives on social media. Detective Morrison testified about Ashley's Pinterest boards and Instagram saved posts. Luxury cars, designer clothes, million-dollar mansions, exotic vacations. Ashley had created an entire fantasy life online, Morrison said. She had boards labeled "My Future," "Goals," "Someday." They were filled with images of extreme wealth and luxury. She'd even started an Instagram account, @LuxuryLifeAsh, where she posted aspirational content, though she only had about 200 followers at the time. In her diary, yes, despite being a digital native, Ashley kept a physical diary, which would later become key evidence. She wrote extensively about her frustrations with her current life. "I'm so tired of being seen as the rich girl from Connecticut," one entry from May 2019 read. "I'm not rich. My parents are rich. I drive a hand-me-down Honda. I have to get permission to buy anything over $100. I have a curfew like I'm a child. Everyone thinks my life is perfect, but they don't understand, it's their money, not mine. And it won't be mine for 9 more years. 9 years. I'll be 25. My life will be half over." Another entry from July 2019, Brandon says there might be a way to make it happen sooner. "I don't know if he's serious or just venting. But God, wouldn't that be amazing? To actually have control over our own lives? To not have to ask permission for everything?" And then, chillingly, an entry from August 12, 2019, less than a month before the murders. "I think we're really going to do it. I'm scared but also excited. Is that wrong? Brandon says we have to be careful. Plan everything perfectly. Leave nothing to chance. He's been researching. I've been researching. We can do this. We can actually do this. Freedom is so close I can taste it." These diary entries would become some of the most powerful evidence in the prosecution's case. They demonstrated not just premeditation but excitement, a complete lack of remorse or hesitation. Ashley wasn't a reluctant participant being coerced by her older brother. She was an enthusiastic partner in planning their parents' deaths. But how exactly did two teenagers plan to commit a double murder and get away with it? That's what we're going to explore next. Planning a murder is complicated. Planning a murder that you think you can get away with? That requires research, careful thought, and a chilling level of detachment from morality. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell spent nearly 6 months planning their parents' murders. 6 months of research, discussion, rehearsal, and preparation. And they documented almost all of it in encrypted messages, deleted browser history, and, bizarrely, in a shared Google Doc that they thought they deleted but which was recovered by forensic investigators. The Google Doc was titled Project Freedom. I'm not making that up. These teenagers literally created a planning document for murdering their parents and gave it an optimistic, aspirational name. Detective James Harper, lead investigator on the case, testified about the contents of this document. It was chilling, Harper said. His voice, normally steady and professional, wavered slightly when describing what they found. It was organized like a project plan. There were sections, timelines, task lists. They'd even color-coded things based on priority. It was methodical, clinical, like they were planning a vacation, not a double homicide. Let me walk you through what was in Project Freedom. And I'm warning you now, this gets dark. Section 1. Method. The document began with a comparison of different murder methods. I'm not going to go into detailed specifics here because I don't want to create a how-to guide, but they'd considered everything from poisoning to staged accidents to direct violence. They ultimately settled on a method they referred to as home invasion gone wrong. The plan was to make the murders look like the Hartwells had been victims of a random break-in. Robberies in wealthy neighborhoods, while rare, do happen. The siblings calculated that if they staged things correctly, police would assume that Thomas and Linda had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But here's where their plan showed both cunning and naivete. They understood enough about forensics to know they needed to avoid obvious mistakes. No clear signs of an inside job, no obvious financial motive, careful handling of evidence. But they were also teenagers who'd learned everything they knew from Wikipedia articles and true crime podcasts. Their understanding of actual police investigative techniques was superficial at best. Section 2. Alibi. This section detailed how they would establish alibis for themselves. The plan was clever, I'll give them that. They chose September 13, 2019, a Friday night. They would both supposedly be at a party thrown by their classmate Justin Meyer at his family's lake house about 45 minutes away. They'd show up to the party early, make sure lots of people saw them, post on social media, establish their presence. Then they'd quietly slip away around 9 p.m., do the deed, and return to the party by 11 p.m. The timeline was tight but doable. They'd done practice runs of the drive from the Meyer Lake house to their own home. 38 minutes in light traffic. They figured they'd need 20 minutes for the actual murders and staging the scene. That gave them about 2 hours total, with a small buffer for unexpected delays. But this is where overconfidence started to creep into their plan. They assumed that no one at the party would notice them missing for 2 hours. They assumed that witnesses wouldn't be able to pin down exactly when they arrived or left. They assumed that their social media posts would provide an airtight digital alibi. They were wrong on all counts. But we'll get to that. Section 3. Execution. I need to be careful here because the details are graphic. But understanding how they planned to kill Thomas and Linda is crucial to understanding both the crime and the trial that followed. The weapons of choice were knives from their own kitchen. The reasoning was simple. No gun purchases to trace, no unusual items to explain. Just knives that were already in the house, that their fingerprints would naturally be on. The plan called for Brandon to handle Thomas while Ashley dealt with Linda. They believed, incorrectly, that this would be quick and relatively clean if they struck without warning. The section on execution showed a complete disconnection from reality. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elena Rodriguez would later testify. They'd written things like, ensure quick incapacitation, and minimal noise. They were using clinical, detached language to describe murdering their own parents. It's classic compartmentalization, a way of emotionally distancing themselves from what they were planning to do. The document also included detailed notes on post-murder staging. Take electronics, laptop, jewelry, cash, to make it look like robbery, damage the back door to simulate forced entry, ransack the master bedroom, dispose of stolen items in different locations, clean themselves thoroughly before returning to the party. They'd even created a checklist. An actual checklist for murder. Section 4. Aftermath. This section dealt with how they would handle the discovery of their parents' bodies and the subsequent investigation. The plan was for them to discover, the bodies together when they returned home from the party, probably around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. They would call 911 hysterical. They would be the grieving children traumatized by this horrible random act of violence. They'd researched how to behave during police questioning. Ashley had made a note. Remember, we're in shock. We don't remember exact times. We were drinking at the party. Details are fuzzy. Stay consistent but not too consistent. That looks rehearsed. For teenagers, I have to admit, it was a relatively sophisticated plan. Not sophisticated enough to work, obviously, but more thought out than many adult criminals manage. The document also discussed what they'd do after the inheritance came through, where they'd live, how they'd explain their wealth to friends, whether they'd stay in Connecticut or move somewhere else. Ashley had written, move to California, LA or San Diego, somewhere sunny. Start my influencer career for real. No more pretending. Finally live the life I'm supposed to have. Brandon had written, pay off debts. Maybe take a year off before college. Travel. Figure out what I really want to do without dad breathing down my neck. Finally be free. That word kept appearing throughout their planning documents. Freedom. They saw their parents not as people, not as human beings who loved them, but as obstacles. As wardens in a prison of privilege. As the only thing standing between them and the lives they believed they deserved. But documents and plans are one thing. Actually committing murder is something else entirely. Did Brandon and Ashley have the psychological capacity to go through with it? Before we get to the night of the murders themselves, we need to understand the psychology at play here. Because parricide, the killing of one's parents, is actually extremely rare, even among homicides. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the forensic psychologist I mentioned earlier, was called as an expert witness by the prosecution to explain the psychological profile of children who kill their parents. Parricide represents approximately 2% of all homicides in the United States, Dr. Rodriguez testified. And the overwhelming majority of those cases involve severe abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse so extreme that the child feels they have no other option for survival. That's not what we're dealing with here. She continued, the Hartwell case is much rarer, what we call instrumental parricide motivated by greed. The children weren't trying to escape abuse. They were trying to access an inheritance. This requires a very specific and very disturbing psychological profile. According to Dr. Rodriguez, successful instrumental parricide requires several psychological traits. 1. Extreme narcissism. The perpetrators must have an inflated sense of their own importance and entitlement. They must believe, fundamentally, that their desires matter more than other people's lives, even their own parents' lives. Both Brandon and Ashley showed narcissistic traits, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their social media presence, their obsession with appearance and status, their belief that they deserved wealth without working for it, these are all consistent with narcissistic personality disorder. 2. Lack of empathy. To kill your parents in cold blood requires an almost complete absence of empathy. You have to be able to look at the people who raised you, fed you, loved you, and see them as nothing more than obstacles. The language in their planning documents was telling, Dr. Rodriguez said. They never referred to Thomas and Linda as Mom and Dad. It was always the parents or T and L. This distancing language helped them dehumanize their victims. 3. Poor impulse control combined with planning ability. This might seem contradictory, but Dr. Rodriguez explained that these killers often have a mix of impulsiveness, the initial decision to kill, and methodical planning ability, the execution of that decision. The gambling, the debt, the immediate desire for gratification, that's Brandon's impulsiveness, she said. But then the months of planning, the detailed documents, the rehearsals, that's where his intelligence and his ability to delay some gratification comes in. It's a dangerous combination. 4. Moral disengagement. This is perhaps the most crucial factor. The killers must be able to somehow justify their actions to themselves. They must construct a narrative where they're not the villains. In their messages to each other, Brandon and Ashley repeatedly framed their parents as controlling, as obstacles to their happiness, Dr. Rodriguez testified. They convinced themselves that Thomas and Linda were being unreasonable by making them wait for the inheritance. They reframed murder not as evil but as a necessary step toward freedom. It's textbook moral disengagement. But Dr. Rodriguez also introduced a more controversial theory. She believed that Brandon and Ashley had reinforced each other's worst instincts through a folie à deux, a shared psychosis. When you have two people feeding off each other's dark impulses, validating each other's thoughts, eliminating each other's doubts, it creates a feedback loop, she explained. Alone, either Brandon or Ashley might have stopped short of murder. But together they encouraged each other forward. They made it seem not just possible but rational. The defense, of course, disputed this characterization. Their expert witness, Dr. Harold Chin, argued that Brandon and Ashley were products of their environment, an environment of extreme pressure and impossible expectations. These were children raised in a pressure cooker, Dr. Chin testified. Thomas Hartwell, despite his philanthropy and public persona, was an authoritarian parent who demanded perfection. When Brandon stumbled, with his gambling problem, instead of offering help, Thomas threatened to destroy his son's future. That's not love. That's control. Dr. Chin continued, and Ashley was raised in an environment where worth was measured by appearance, by social status, by material success. Linda Hartwell, while perhaps more nurturing than Thomas, enabled this value system. She never taught Ashley that there were more important things than wealth and status. The defense argued that while Brandon and Ashley's actions were horrific and unjustifiable, they weren't born from pure evil. They were born from a toxic family dynamic that prioritized success over emotional health, money over connection, image over authenticity. Did Thomas and Linda Hartwell deserve to die? Of course not, defense attorney Marcus Holbrook argued. But did they create an environment that pushed their children toward desperate acts? The evidence suggests they did. It was a gutsy defense strategy, essentially blaming the victims for their own murders. And it was one that would deeply divide public opinion. As September 2019 approached, Brandon and Ashley Hartwell were putting the final pieces of their plan into motion. The tension in the house was palpable, though Thomas and Linda had no idea why. Linda's sister, Patricia Monroe, would later testify that she'd spoken with Linda just 3 days before the murders. Linda told me she was worried about the kids, Patricia said, her voice breaking slightly. She said Brandon had been distant, spending a lot of time in his room. And Ashley seemed stressed, more than usual. Linda thought it was just back-to-school jitters. Brandon was leaving for Cornell in a few weeks, and Ashley was starting junior year. She thought they were just anxious about the transitions. Patricia continued, Linda said, I wish I could make it easier for them. I wish I could take away their stress. She was planning a family dinner for that Friday night, September 13th, as a way to reconnect before Brandon left. She was making Brandon's favorite, lasagna and tiramisu. She was so excited about it. She wanted one last perfect family night. But while Linda was planning a loving family dinner, her children were finalizing plans for her murder. The week before September 13th, Brandon and Ashley went through their checklist one final time. They'd been communicating exclusively through encrypted apps, deleting messages after reading them, or so they thought. What they didn't realize was that even deleted messages leave digital forensic traces. September 9th, Monday. 4 days before the murders. Brandon sent Ashley a message at 11:47 p.m. Are you still in? Last chance to back out. Ashley responded at 11:52 p.m. I'm in. Are you? Brandon at 11:54 p.m. Yeah. Friday night. Just like we planned. Ashley at 11:55 p.m. I can't believe we're really doing this. Brandon at 11:58 p.m. We have to. There's no other way. You know that. Ashley at 12:02 a.m. I know. Freedom or nothing. That phrase, freedom or nothing, had become their mantra. They'd repeated it to each other dozens of times over the months of planning. It was how they psyched themselves up, how they justified what they were about to do. September 10th, Tuesday. Brandon made several purchases that day that would later become evidence. At a Home Depot 30 minutes from their home, far enough that he thought no one would recognize him, he bought heavy-duty trash bags, bleach, rubber gloves, and duct tape. He paid cash. He wore a baseball cap and sunglasses. But here's what Brandon didn't know. Home Depot has extensive surveillance systems. And he'd driven his own car to the store, a silver Honda Civic that his parents had bought him for his 17th birthday. Security footage showed both his license plate and a clear view of his face when he took off his sunglasses while browsing. That same day, Ashley withdrew $500 in cash from the ATM at her bank. Her explanation to investigators later would be that she needed the cash for shopping. But the prosecution would argue that this was part of the staging. They needed cash to take from the house to make the robbery look real. September 11th, Wednesday. This was the day they did their final test run. According to cell phone tower data and GPS records from Brandon's phone, both siblings drove from their house to the Meyer Lake house and back, timing the route. The route took 36 minutes, slightly faster than their previous practice runs. They were satisfied with the timing. That evening, Thomas tried to have a conversation with Brandon about Cornell, about the upcoming transition, about how proud he was despite their recent conflicts about the gambling debt. We know this because Linda mentioned it in a text to Patricia that night at 9:47 p.m. Thomas just had a long talk with Brandon. I think they're finally working through things. Thomas told him he loves him and believes in him. Brandon seemed emotional but in a good way. Maybe we've turned a corner. Patricia never responded to that text. She was already asleep. By the time she woke up the next morning, she'd forgotten about it entirely. It would be the last text message Linda Hartwell ever sent. September 12th, Thursday. 24 hours before the murders. This was a normal day by all accounts. Thomas went to work. Linda ran errands and prepared for the family dinner she had planned for the next night. Brandon attended his classes at Springfield Oaks Academy. Ashley had cheerleading practice after school. But beneath the surface of normalcy, both Brandon and Ashley were methodically preparing for what was to come. Brandon went through his closet and selected the clothes he would wear the next night. Dark jeans, a black t-shirt, dark sneakers. Clothes that wouldn't show blood. Clothes that he could easily dispose of afterward. Ashley updated her Instagram story throughout the day with cheerful, normal content. A photo of her latte at Starbucks. A selfie with her cheer squad. A boomerang of her doing a back handspring. Every post was carefully curated to establish normalcy, to show that she was just a regular teenager living a regular life. Her final Instagram story before the murders was posted at 8:34 p.m. on September 12th. It was a photo of a sunset with the caption, "New beginnings are often disguised as painful endings." Several of Ashley's followers would later tell police that this post seemed ominous in hindsight. But at the time, it just seemed like typical teen inspirational content. The kind of vaguely philosophical quote that teenagers post constantly without any deeper meaning. Except in this case there was a deeper meaning. That night, Brandon and Ashley met in Brandon's room after their parents had gone to bed. We know this because Brandon's laptop showed activity from both of their accounts at 11:17 p.m. They were logged into their shared Google Drive, accessing Project Freedom one last time. Detective Harper testified about what the digital forensics revealed. They went through their plan step by step, checking off items, making final notes. The last entry in the document was made at 11:43 p.m. on September 12th. It was just 2 words typed by Ashley, "Tomorrow." Finally. After that, they both deleted their browsing history, cleared their caches, and shut down their devices. They thought they were being careful. They thought they'd covered their tracks. They had no idea that digital forensics experts would be able to recover everything. September 13th, Friday. The day of the murders. The day started normally. Eerily, terrifyingly normally. Thomas left for work at 7:30 a.m., same as every weekday. He kissed Linda goodbye. He told Brandon and Ashley he'd see them at dinner. He reminded Brandon that he loved him and was proud of him. Linda made breakfast, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast. She sat with Ashley while they ate, talking about Ashley's day. She asked about school, about cheerleading, about Ashley's plans for the weekend. "Are you sure you want to go to this party at Justin's?" Linda asked. "You know you're always welcome to skip it and stay home for family dinner." Ashley would later tell police that she almost broke down in that moment. Almost confessed everything. Almost begged her mother for forgiveness for what she was about to do. But she didn't. Instead, Ashley smiled and said, "I want to go to the party, Mom. But I'll be thinking about your lasagna. Can we do family dinner on Sunday instead?" Linda smiled back. "Of course, sweetie. Sunday dinner. I'll make it extra special." There would never be a Sunday dinner. There would never be anything special again. Because in less than 12 hours, Linda Hartwell would be dead. Brandon spent most of the day in his room. He told his parents he was studying and packing for Cornell. In reality, he was going over the plan obsessively, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. At 2:47 p.m. he sent Ashley a message, "Tonight. No backing out now." Ashley responded at 2:51 p.m., "I won't back out if you won't." Brandon at 2:52 p.m., "We're doing this." Ashley at 2:53 p.m., "We're doing this." At 4:15 p.m., Thomas came home from work early. He wanted to help Linda prepare for the family dinner. He stopped at the store and bought flowers, white roses, Linda's favorite. He brought home a bottle of expensive wine to celebrate the end of summer and the beginning of Brandon's college journey. He was in a good mood. A great mood, actually. Multiple witnesses at the store where he bought the flowers remembered him because he was so friendly, so cheerful. He told the cashier, "I've got the best family in the world. Sometimes you've got to remind yourself of that, you know?" The cashier, a young woman named Emily Thornton, would break down on the witness stand when she testified about this interaction. "He seemed so happy," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He was talking about his kids, about how proud he was of them. He said he'd been too hard on his son lately and wanted to make it up to him. He was a good person. You could tell. And I sold him flowers for his wife, and then I sent him home to die. I sent him home to be murdered by his own children." At 5:30 p.m., the Hartwell family sat down together in the living room. This was their routine on Friday evenings. They'd gather before dinner, talk about their weeks, reconnect. We know what happened during this gathering because Linda was texting with Patricia. 5:32 p.m. Linda, "Family time. Thomas is being so sweet. He brought me flowers." 5:39 p.m. Linda, "Brandon seems quiet but okay. Ashley is on her phone as usual. But we're together and that's what matters." 5:47 p.m. Linda, "I love my family so much. Sometimes I look at them and just feel overwhelmed with gratitude. How did I get so lucky?" That was the last text Linda Hartwell would ever send. At 6 p.m. they had dinner. Linda's famous lasagna, garlic bread, Caesar salad. The tiramisu was chilling in the refrigerator for dessert. Thomas sat at the head of the table. Linda to his right, Brandon to his left, Ashley next to Linda. A typical family dinner. Except it wasn't typical at all. Because two of the people at that table were planning to murder the other two in less than 3 hours. "How was school this week, Ash?" Thomas asked, serving himself lasagna. "Fine," Ashley said. She was pushing food around her plate, barely eating. "Just fine?" Linda pressed gently. "Your cheer routine looked amazing on Instagram." Ashley forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom." "Yeah, it's going well." Brandon was equally quiet. When Thomas tried to engage him in conversation about Cornell, about which classes he was most excited about his dorm assignment, Brandon gave minimal responses. "Yes, no, I don't know yet. We'll see." "Brandon, are you feeling okay?" Linda asked, concerned. "You've barely touched your food." "I'm fine, Mom. Just nervous about the party tonight. You know how I get anxious in social situations." This was a lie, of course. Brandon had never been anxious in social situations. He was popular, athletic, confident. But Linda accepted the explanation because she wanted to believe her son was okay. Thomas looked at both of his children, clearly sensing something was off. "You know, if you two don't want to go to this party, you can stay home. We can watch a movie, play some board games like we used to. Make it a family night." For a brief moment, Brandon and Ashley locked eyes across the table. Later, investigators and psychologists would analyze that moment extensively. Was there hesitation? Doubt? A last chance to turn back? If there was, it passed quickly. "No, Dad, we want to go," Brandon said. "Justin's expecting us. We promised." Thomas nodded, disappointed but understanding. "All right. But be safe. And call if you need anything. Doesn't matter what time." Dinner ended around 7:15 p.m. Brandon and Ashley helped clean up, something Linda would later note was unusual. They rarely volunteered to help with dishes. "You two are being so helpful tonight," Linda said, smiling. "What's the occasion?" Ashley hugged her mother. A long, tight hug that made Linda pause. "Just love you, Mom," Ashley said. It would be the last time she ever hugged her mother. At 7:45 p.m., Brandon and Ashley left for the party. They took Brandon's Honda Civic. They'd packed an overnight bag with changes of clothes, as they told their parents they might stay over at the Meyer Lake house if it got too late. "Have fun." Linda called from the doorway. "Text me when you get there." "Will do, Mom." Ashley called back. Thomas stood next to Linda, his arm around her waist, watching their children drive away. "They grow up so fast," Thomas said. "Too fast," Linda agreed. They stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear down the street. Then they went back inside, closed the door and locked it. They had no idea that in just a few hours that locked door wouldn't matter. Because the killers were already family. The killers had keys. The killers knew the security code. The killers were their own children. Justin Meyer's lake house was packed by 8:30 p.m. It was the first big party of the school year, and nearly 100 students from Springfield Oaks Academy and neighboring schools had shown up. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell arrived at 8:17 p.m. We know the exact time because Ashley posted an Instagram story as they pulled up to the house. A selfie of her and Brandon with the caption, "Party time. Party popper." The metadata on the photo confirmed the time and location. Their arrival was strategic. They needed to be seen. They needed people to remember that they were there, that they were having fun, that they were just normal teenagers at a normal party. And for the next 45 minutes, that's exactly what they did. Justin Meyer, the host, testified about their behavior that evening. They seemed totally normal, Justin said. Brandon was playing beer pong. Ashley was hanging out with her friends. They were laughing, taking pictures, just being themselves. There was nothing weird about their behavior at all. But several witnesses would later note small details that seemed off in hindsight. Melissa Kowalski, Ashley's best friend, testified that Ashley seemed a little distracted. She kept checking her phone, Melissa said. Not texting or anything. Just checking the time. When I asked her if she was okay, she said she was fine. Said she just didn't want to lose track of time because she promised her mom she'd text when she arrived. Which was weird because Ashley usually doesn't care about stuff like that. At 8:42 p.m. Ashley did text Linda, made it to the party, having fun with Melissa. Love you. Linda responded within seconds, glad you're safe, sweetheart. Have a wonderful time. Love you so much. That text message would become one of the most painful pieces of evidence in the trial. Linda's words, love you so much, sent less than an hour before her children murdered her. At 8:55 p.m., Brandon found Ashley in the kitchen. Multiple witnesses saw them having what appeared to be an intense conversation in the corner, away from the crowd. Rachel Simmons, a classmate, testified about what she observed. They were talking really close to each other like they didn't want anyone to hear. Brandon looked stressed. Ashley looked, I don't know, excited? Maybe nervous? Something intense. I remember thinking it was weird because usually at parties, Brandon is super social and Ashley is the life of the party. But they seemed really focused on each other. At 9:03 p.m., Brandon and Ashley quietly slipped out the back door of the lake house. Several people saw them leave, but no one thought much of it. People were constantly going in and out, to smoke, to get fresh air, to hook up in cars or in the woods. But Brandon and Ashley didn't go into the woods. They went to Brandon's Honda Civic, parked about 200 yards from the main house in an overflow parking area. They sat in the car for a moment before Brandon started the engine. According to Ashley's later confession, we'll get to that confession in detail later, they had one final conversation. Brandon, this is it. Are you ready? Ashley, I'm scared. Brandon, me too. But we have to do it. There's no other way. Ashley, what if something goes wrong? Brandon, nothing will go wrong. We've planned everything. Stick to the plan. Ashley, what if I can't actually do it? When it comes to actually hurting Mom? Brandon, then I'll do it. Both of them. You just have to help me stage everything afterward. Can you do that? Ashley, yeah. I can do that. And with that, Brandon pulled out of the parking area and began the 36-minute drive back to 847 Maple Ridge Drive. Back to their home. Back to their parents. Back to commit double murder. The drive was mostly silent. Ashley would later tell police that she kept thinking about her mother. About Linda's smile at dinner. About the way she'd hugged her goodbye. About all the times Linda had comforted her when she was sad, celebrated with her when she was happy, loved her unconditionally. But then she'd think about the inheritance. About the life she wanted. About freedom. And those thoughts were enough to push away the doubt, to steel her resolve. I kept telling myself that it was necessary, Ashley would say in her confession. That they were holding us back. That it was the only way. I had to keep repeating it over and over like a mantra. Otherwise, I think I would have told Brandon to turn around. But she didn't tell Brandon to turn around. And Brandon, for his part, showed no hesitation whatsoever. They arrived back at Maple Ridge Drive at 9:41 p.m. Brandon parked 2 blocks away from their house, on a quiet side street where his car wouldn't be noticed. They'd left the party at 9:03 p.m. The drive had taken 38 minutes. That left them approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes before they needed to be back at the party to maintain their alibi. They sat in the darkness for a moment, looking at each other. No going back after this, Brandon said. I know, Ashley replied. They got out of the car. Brandon opened the trunk and retrieved a black backpack. Inside were gloves, trash bags, bleach, and the change of clothes they'd packed. They already knew which knives they'd use. They were in the kitchen knife block. No need to bring weapons. The weapons were already home, waiting. They walked through the quiet neighborhood toward their house. It was 9:47 p.m. Most of their neighbors were inside, watching TV or getting ready for bed. No one saw them. No one had any idea what was about to happen. When they reached their house, all the lights were on downstairs. Through the front window they could see the blue glow of the television in the living room. Thomas and Linda were home, alive, completely unaware that their children had returned to kill them. Brandon and Ashley walked around to the back of the house. They knew the side gate code. They knew where the security cameras were pointed. They disabled the one covering the back door earlier that week, claiming it was malfunctioning. Thomas had meant to call the security company to fix it but hadn't gotten around to it yet. They reached the back door. Brandon pulled out his key. His hand was shaking. "You're shaking," Ashley whispered. "I'm fine," Brandon whispered back. He put the key in the lock. Turned it. The door opened. They were inside. And what happened next would haunt everyone involved with this case for the rest of their lives. Before I continue, I need to give you a very serious content warning. What I'm about to describe is graphic, disturbing, and extremely violent. The details of Thomas and Linda Hartwell's murders are not easy to hear. They're not easy to talk about. But they're necessary to understand the full scope of what Brandon and Ashley did. To understand why this case shocked the nation. To understand why the prosecution sought the harshest possible penalties. If you need to step away, now is the time. I'll pause for 10 seconds. Still with me? Okay, let's continue. Brandon and Ashley entered through the back door into the mudroom. From there, they could hear the television in the living room. A home improvement show was playing, something Linda liked to watch on Friday nights. They crept through the kitchen, moving as quietly as possible. Brandon went to the knife block and withdrew 2 knives, a 10-inch chef's knife and an 8-inch utility knife. He handed the utility knife to Ashley. She took it, and later she would say that the weight of it in her hand made everything suddenly horrifyingly real. The plan had been for them to attack together. Brandon would go for Thomas while Ashley went for Linda, striking quickly and without warning while their parents were distracted by the TV. But when they reached the living room doorway and looked inside, Ashley froze. Thomas and Linda were on the couch together. Thomas had his arm around Linda. Her head was resting on his shoulder. They were relaxed, comfortable, happy. They looked like what they were, a married couple, still in love after 25 years, enjoying a quiet Friday night together. Ashley couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do what she'd promised she'd do. Brandon looked at her, whispered, "Now." Ashley shook her head, tears starting to stream down her face. Brandon's expression hardened. He'd later claimed that in that moment, he realized he'd have to do everything himself. What happened next happened fast. Much faster than Brandon and Ashley had anticipated in their planning. Brandon entered the living room. He was later asked by police why he didn't simply turn around and leave at that point. Why he didn't abandon the plan when Ashley couldn't go through with it. His answer was chilling. "I'd already made up my mind. There was no going back. I was committed." Thomas heard the footsteps and turned around. When he saw Brandon standing there with a knife, there was a moment of confusion. Not fear, not yet. Just confusion. Because why would his son be standing in the living room with a kitchen knife? "Brandon? What are you doing? I thought you were at the party?" Those were Thomas Hartwell's last words. Brandon moved fast, crossing the living room in 3 strides. Thomas started to stand, started to put himself between Brandon and Linda, started to reach out to his son, maybe to defend himself, maybe to try to talk him down, maybe simply out of instinct. It didn't matter. Brandon stabbed his father in the chest. The forensic pathologist, Dr. William Chin, testified about Thomas's injuries in excruciating detail. The first wound entered the left side of the chest, penetrating between the 4th and 5th ribs, Dr. Chin stated clinically. It punctured the left lung and nicked the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart. This wound alone would have been serious but not immediately fatal. But there wasn't just one wound, Dr. Chin continued. Thomas Hartwell sustained 17 stab wounds. 7 to the chest, 4 to the abdomen, 3 to the arms, defensive wounds consistent with trying to protect himself or fight back, and 3 to the neck, one of which severed the carotid artery. Thomas Hartwell died in his living room, on the carpet in front of the couch where he'd been peacefully watching TV with his wife moments before. He bled out in approximately 4 minutes. But here's what makes this even more horrific. Linda watched it happen. Linda Hartwell's screams, shrill, terrified, heartbroken, filled the house. She was screaming for Thomas. Screaming for Brandon to stop. Screaming for help that would never come. She tried to reach Thomas to help him, to save him. But Brandon turned on her next. And Ashley, who had frozen in the doorway, who had been unable to attack her mother as planned, did not run for help. Did not call 911. Did not try to stop her brother. Instead, she closed and locked the front door, making sure no one could get in. Making sure her mother couldn't escape. Dr. Chen's testimony about Linda's injuries was somehow even more painful to hear. Linda Hartwell sustained 23 stab wounds, he said. The disparity in number and the nature of the wounds suggest that she survived longer than her husband. She fought harder. The defensive wounds on her hands and forearms were extensive. She was trying desperately to protect herself. Linda was 59 years old. She weighed 127 pounds. She had no chance against her 18-year-old son who outweighed her by over 80 pounds and had the advantage of surprise, weapon, and absolute lack of mercy. The attack on Linda lasted approximately 6 minutes, according to forensic analysis. 6 minutes of horror, pain, and betrayal. 6 minutes of looking into her son's eyes and seeing a stranger. 6 minutes of dying at the hands of the child she'd raised, loved, and trusted completely. At 9:58 p.m., Linda Hartwell died in her living room, 11 feet from her husband's body. The medical examiner determined that neither Thomas nor Linda died instantly. They were both conscious for at least part of their attacks. They both knew they were being murdered. And they both knew their own children were the ones killing them. I can't imagine anything more horrifying than that. In the aftermath, in the immediate moments after the murders, Brandon and Ashley stood in their living room, surrounded by their parents' bodies, covered in blood, and had to face what they'd just done. Ashley was hysterical, according to her later confession. She was sobbing, hyperventilating, repeating, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," over and over. Brandon, conversely, became very calm, very focused, because now they had to execute the rest of their plan, staging the scene, cleaning themselves up, disposing of evidence, and getting back to the party before anyone realized they'd been gone. "We don't have time for you to fall apart," Brandon told his sister. His exact words, according to Ashley's confession. "We have to finish this. We have to make it look like a robbery. Otherwise, this was all for nothing." And so, with their parents' bodies still warm on the living room floor, Brandon and Ashley set about staging a crime scene. The staging of the Hartwell home took approximately 23 minutes. We know this because of the timeline reconstructed from cell phone data, witness statements, and forensic evidence. At 10:01 p.m., just 3 minutes after Linda died, Brandon and Ashley began implementing the robbery portion of their plan. Brandon went upstairs to the master bedroom. He ransacked it, pulling drawers open, dumping jewelry boxes, taking cash from Thomas's wallet and Linda's purse. He grabbed Thomas's laptop and Linda's iPad. He took Linda's expensive watch and several pieces of jewelry that would be easy to sell. Meanwhile, Ashley was downstairs trying to breathe, trying to not look at her parents' bodies, trying to figure out how she was going to live with what she'd just witnessed and enabled. Brandon came back downstairs carrying a pillowcase filled with the items he'd taken. He went to the back door, the one they'd entered through, and used a crowbar from the garage to damage the door frame, making it look like forced entry. He broke the small window next to the door from the outside, reaching through to unlock it. This would be the entry point that police would supposedly find. But here's where Brandon made his first major mistake. The glass from the broken window fell mostly inside the house. When you break a window from the outside, most of the glass should fall inward. But some should fall outward too. The pattern wasn't quite right, though no one would catch this detail until later, during detailed forensic analysis. At 10:18 p.m., Brandon and Ashley changed their clothes in the garage. They brought clean clothes in their overnight bag. They stripped off their blood-soaked garments, put them in trash bags, and changed into fresh jeans and t-shirts. They used baby wipes and bottled water from the garage to clean the blood off their skin as best they could. They'd planned to shower, but there wasn't time. They needed to get back to the party. Ashley was still crying, still shaking. Brandon later said he was worried she was going to have a complete breakdown and ruin everything. "Get it together," he told her. "We have to go. We have to be back at the party. If anyone realizes we were gone this long, we're done." At 10:24 p.m., Brandon and Ashley left their house for the second time that night. They walked back to where they'd parked the car, carrying the trash bags with their bloody clothes and the pillowcase with the stolen items. They drove to a dumpster behind a shopping center about 2 miles away and threw the trash bags inside. They'd planned to dispose of the stolen items in several different locations to make it look like random robbery loot, but they were running out of time. Instead, Brandon drove to a lake about 5 miles from the party house and threw the pillowcase, laptop, iPad, jewelry, and all into the water. It was dark. No one saw them. Or so they thought. What they didn't know was that this lake had a hiking trail around it that was popular even at night. And a jogger named Eric Paulson had been running that trail and had seen a car pull up, seen 2 people get out, seen something thrown into the lake, and thought it was suspicious enough to make a mental note of the license plate. Eric didn't report it that night. He wasn't even sure what he'd seen was criminal. But 2 days later, when the Hartwell murders were all over the news and police were asking for anyone with information to come forward, Eric called the tip line. That tip would prove crucial. At 10:52 p.m., 1 hour and 49 minutes after they'd left, Brandon and Ashley returned to the party at the Meyer Lake house. They tried to slip back in quietly, but several people noticed their return. Melissa Kowalski saw Ashley come back in and went over to her immediately. "Where have you been?" Melissa asked. "I've been looking for you." Ashley, to her credit, stuck to the cover story they'd prepared. "Brandon and I went for a drive. We needed to talk about something private. Family stuff. You know how it is." But Melissa noticed something off about Ashley's appearance. "You changed clothes?" Melissa said. It wasn't a question. Ashley laughed it off. "Yeah, I spilled beer all over myself like an idiot. Brandon had extra clothes in his car, so I changed." "Why does this look weird?" The outfit did look weird, actually. Ashley had been wearing a cute crop top and jeans earlier. Now she was wearing an oversized hoodie and different jeans. It was September, warm enough that a hoodie seemed excessive. But Melissa didn't push it. She just assumed Ashley was telling the truth. Why wouldn't she? Who would suspect that their best friend had just helped commit double murder? Brandon rejoined the beer pong game. He was laughing, joking, acting completely normal. Multiple witnesses would later testify that he seemed relaxed. More relaxed than he'd been earlier in the evening, in fact. It was like whatever had been bothering him earlier was resolved. Justin Meyer testified. He was back to being the Brandon we all knew. Life of the party. Because in Brandon's mind, his problems were resolved. His father was dead. His controlling, demanding, impossible-to-please father was gone. And soon, once they got through the investigation, once the estate was settled, he would have millions of dollars and complete freedom. At 11:47 p.m., Ashley posted another Instagram story. It was a group photo of her with Melissa and 3 other friends, all smiling, all holding red Solo cups. The caption, "Best friends plus best night." 2 hearts. This post would later be analyzed extensively by both prosecution and defense teams. The prosecution argued it showed Ashley's callousness, posting cheerful content less than 2 hours after murdering her mother. The defense argued it showed she was in shock, dissociating, going through the motions in a psychological fugue state. Either way, the image is chilling. Ashley is smiling in that photo. A genuine-looking smile. Her makeup is perfect. She looks happy. 2 hours earlier, she'd watched her mother die. The party continued until around 2:30 a.m. Brandon and Ashley stayed the entire time, maintaining their alibi, acting like normal teenagers at a normal party. At 2:47 a.m., they told Justin they were heading home. They'd been drinking, not heavily but enough to establish that they'd been at a party, and they claimed they didn't want to wake up their parents by staying out too late. "Tell your parents thanks for letting us use the lake house," Ashley told Justin, hugging him goodbye. "Will do," Justin said. "Drive safe, guys." Brandon and Ashley got back into Brandon's Honda Civic and began the drive home. According to Ashley's later confession, this is when the reality of what they'd done truly began to sink in. "We didn't talk much during the drive," Ashley told investigators. "I kept replaying everything in my mind. Seeing Mom's face. Hearing her screams. The blood. So much blood. I started crying again, and Brandon told me I needed to pull myself together before we got home. He said we had to act shocked when we found them. We had to be convincing." They discussed what they would do when they discovered the bodies. They'd call 911 immediately. They'd be hysterical, which wouldn't be hard for Ashley, who was already barely holding it together. They'd tell police they'd been at the party all night, that dozens of people could verify it. They'd be the grieving children, the traumatized victims of a horrible random crime. And it almost worked. Almost. At 3:16 a.m., Brandon pulled into the driveway at 847 Maple Ridge Drive. The house was dark. Quiet. Exactly as they'd left it 5.5 hours earlier. They sat in the car for a moment, preparing themselves. "You ready?" Brandon asked. "No," Ashley said. "But let's get it over with." They got out of the car and approached the front door. Brandon unlocked it with his key. They stepped inside. And then Ashley began screaming. "Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh, Dad." She ran to the living room where her parents' bodies still lay on the floor, exactly where they'd fallen. The blood had dried. The smell was terrible, copper and death and horror. Ashley's screams were real. Her horror was real. Even though she'd known exactly what they would find, seeing her parents' bodies again, cold and stiff and lifeless, broke something in her. At 3:18 a.m., Brandon called 911. The call would later be played in court, and it's one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. 911, what's your emergency? Oh God, please help us. Brandon's voice is panicked, breathless, convincing. It's my parents, someone killed them. There's blood everywhere. Please send help. Sir, I need you to calm down and tell me what happened. What's your location? 847 Maple Ridge Drive, Springfield Oaks. Please hurry. My parents, they're dead. Someone killed them. Are you sure they're deceased? Can you check for a pulse? Yes, no, I don't know. There's so much blood. My sister is... Ashley, don't touch them. Ashley. Ashley's wailing can be heard in the background of the call. Genuine, heartbroken, anguished wailing. Sir, I need you to stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. Can you tell me if you see anyone else in the house? Are you safe? I don't know. We just got home. We were at a party and we came home and found them like this. The back door, it looks like someone broke in. The 911 call lasted 7 minutes and 33 seconds. Brandon played his part perfectly, scared, confused, grief-stricken. He answered the dispatcher's questions. He followed her instructions. He stayed on the line until police arrived. At 3:25 a.m., the first police units arrived at the Hartwell residence. Officers Matthew Reeves and Sarah Chin were first on scene. Their body camera footage would later be used extensively in the trial. They found Brandon and Ashley outside on the front lawn. Ashley was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth, crying. Brandon was standing, pacing, running his hands through his hair. They're inside, Brandon told the officers. Our parents, someone killed them. Please, you have to help them. Officers Reeves and Chin entered the house, weapons drawn. They cleared the first floor, then found Thomas and Linda's bodies in the living room. Jesus Christ, Officer Reeves muttered. His body camera captured the scene in stark detail. The blood, the defensive wounds, the sheer violence of what had occurred. We need detectives and CSI, Officer Chin radioed. Double homicide. Appears to be a home invasion. 2 victims, apparent knife wounds. Deceased for several hours by the look of it. Within 20 minutes, the scene was swarming with police, detectives, crime scene investigators, and medical examiners. The quiet neighborhood of Maple Ridge Drive was suddenly lit up with red and blue lights, police tape, and the chaos of a major crime scene. Detective James Harper arrived at 3:52 a.m. He'd been called at home, pulled out of bed to respond to what was being described as one of the most brutal murders Springfield Oaks had ever seen. His first action was to interview the 2 witnesses, the children who'd discovered the bodies. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell. Detective Harper had been a homicide investigator for 17 years. He'd seen hundreds of crime scenes, interviewed countless witnesses and suspects, and developed a sixth sense for when something wasn't quite right. And from the moment he started talking to Brandon and Ashley Hartwell, something wasn't quite right. The initial interviews took place in the back of separate police vehicles, about an hour after police arrived. Brandon and Ashley were separated, standard procedure, and each given a victim advocate to sit with them. Harper started with Brandon. Brandon, I'm Detective Harper. I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay? Brandon nodded, wiping his eyes. Anything to help. Anything to find who did this. Can you walk me through your evening? Where were you tonight? Brandon's story was consistent with what he'd told the 911 dispatcher. He and Ashley had gone to a party at Justin Meyer's lake house. They'd been there from about 8:30 p.m. until 2:45 a.m. Dozens of people had seen them there. And when you got home, what did you find? The house was dark. We came in through the front door and Ashley went toward the living room and just started screaming. I ran in and saw, Brandon's voice broke convincingly. I saw them. My parents. Dead. So much blood. Harper took notes, his face neutral. Did you notice anything unusual when you arrived? Any cars you didn't recognize? Anyone lurking around? No, nothing. It was just quiet. Normal. And you didn't hear anything? No sounds from inside the house as you were coming in? No. Nothing. Harper paused, studying Brandon carefully. Your 911 call mentioned that the back door looked like someone had broken in. How did you know that? Did you check the back door before calling? Brandon hesitated. Just for a second. But Harper caught it. I must have seen it when we were running around trying to figure out what happened. I don't really remember. Everything was so chaotic. Harper made a note of that hesitation. Then he asked, Brandon, I have to ask you this, and I know it's going to sound strange, but it's standard procedure. Is there anyone who might have wanted to hurt your parents? Any enemies? Business rivals? Anyone who'd been threatening them? No, Brandon said immediately. Everyone loved my parents. They didn't have enemies. This had to be random. Someone breaking in to rob the house. Does your family keep a lot of cash or valuables at home? Some. My dad had a laptop, my mom had some jewelry. Normal stuff. Harper nodded. We'll check to see if anything's missing. That'll help us understand what happened here. Harper's interview with Ashley was shorter. She was nearly incoherent with grief, or what appeared to be grief. She could barely string sentences together. I can't, Mom and Dad. Ashley, I know this is hard. Just tell me what you can. Between sobs, Ashley gave the same basic story as Brandon. Party at Justin's. Home around 3:15 a.m. Found their parents dead. But there was one exchange that Harper found interesting. Ashley, when you came home, did you and Brandon come in together? Yes. We walked in through the front door. And you went straight to the living room? Yes, I think so. It's all blurry. But you knew to go to the living room? Your parents could have been anywhere in the house. Ashley paused, her crying stopping for just a moment. I guess I saw the blood? Or maybe I don't know. I don't remember. Everything happened so fast. Harper filed that away. These kids had just discovered their murdered parents. Trauma does strange things to memory. But still, something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it yet, but his instincts were telling him to look closer at Brandon and Ashley Hartwell. While Harper was conducting initial interviews, the crime scene investigation unit was processing the house. What they found raised immediate red flags. Crime scene investigator Maria Santos was the lead CSI on the case. She testified extensively during the trial about what they discovered. The first thing that stood out was the back door, Santos said. It had been damaged, the frame was splintered, the window was broken. But the damage pattern didn't quite fit a forced entry. The wood splinters were inconsistent with someone breaking in from outside. Santos continued, then there was the glass from the broken window. Most of it fell inside, which is correct for a break-in. But the pattern of the scatter was odd. And there were no glass fragments on the outside doormat, which there should have been if someone had reached through to unlock the door. But perhaps the most damning piece of physical evidence was what CSI found in the garage. We found wet spots on the garage floor, Santos testified. Testing revealed they were consistent with water mixed with blood. Someone had cleaned themselves in the garage. There were also traces of blood in the utility sink, diluted but definitely there. And we found 3 baby wipes in the garage trash can that tested positive for blood. The garage, where Brandon and Ashley had changed clothes and cleaned up. They'd been so focused on staging the living room and the back door that they'd forgotten about the evidence they were leaving in the garage. But the absolute smoking gun, the piece of evidence that would eventually blow this case wide open, was found by CSI Tech David Wong around 6:30 a.m., 3 hours into processing the scene. I was checking the storm drain at the end of the driveway, Wong testified. Standard procedure. Sometimes perpetrators throw evidence as they're fleeing. And I found a phone. Not just any phone. A smartphone in a waterproof case. It was an iPhone, slightly damaged but still functional. When I powered it on and it asked for a passcode, I saw the wallpaper. It was a photo of Brandon Hartwell and another teenager. I immediately flagged it for the detectives. The phone would later be identified as a burner phone Brandon had purchased months earlier with cash. The phone he'd been using to communicate with Ashley via encrypted apps. And while Brandon had deleted the apps and most of the data, forensic investigators would be able to recover substantial amounts of deleted content, including the messages where they'd planned the murders. But at 6:30 a.m. on September 14th, investigators didn't yet know what was on that phone. They just knew they'd found a piece of potential evidence that one of the victim's children might be able to explain. Detective Harper made a note to ask Brandon about it once he'd had time to process the immediate trauma. Harper still wasn't sure whether Brandon and Ashley were victims or suspects. But he was starting to have a very bad feeling about this whole case. By 8 a.m. on September 14th, news of the Hartwell murders had exploded across local media. By noon it was national news. Double murder in wealthy Connecticut suburb. Beloved millionaire couple found stabbed to death in their home. Children discover parents brutally murdered after returning from party. The story had everything that makes for sensational news coverage. Wealth, violence, a seemingly random attack in a safe neighborhood, and 2 photogenic teenage children now orphaned by this terrible tragedy. The media descended on Springfield Oaks like a swarm of locusts. News vans lined Maple Ridge Drive. Reporters interviewed neighbors, friends, anyone who'd known the Hartwell family. The narrative that emerged in those first 48 hours was one of sympathy for Brandon and Ashley. They were portrayed as victims, not just of losing their parents but of being the ones to find them, of having to live with those images forever. "My heart breaks for those kids," one neighbor told a CNN reporter. "To lose your parents is bad enough, but to find them like that? I can't even imagine." Social media exploded with support for the Hartwell siblings. #Justice for the Hartwells trended on Twitter. Brandon and Ashley's Instagram accounts were flooded with thousands of comments offering condolences and support. A GoFundMe was even started by well-meaning friends to help Brandon and Ashley with funeral expenses, despite the fact that they stood to inherit $42 million once the estate was settled. The fund raised $47,000 in the first day alone. But while the media was painting Brandon and Ashley as grieving victims, Detective Harper and his team were quietly building a very different picture. The burner phone. The evidence of cleanup in the garage. The timeline inconsistencies. The forced entry that didn't quite look right. And then, on September 16th, just 3 days after the murders, the break they'd been waiting for came from an unexpected source. Eric Paulson, the jogger who'd seen 2 people throw something into the lake on the night of the murders. "Detective Harper? My name is Eric Paulson. I think I have information about the Hartwell case. I saw something that night. And I wrote down the license plate of the car I saw." Harper's pulse quickened. "What was the license plate number, Mr. Paulson?" Eric read off the number. Harper checked it against his case file. It was Brandon Hartwell's Honda Civic. That was the moment the investigation shifted. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell went from grieving children to prime suspects. And Detective Harper knew exactly what he had to do next. On the morning of September 17th, 4 days after the murders, Detective Harper called a meeting with his entire investigative team, the district attorney, and the department's digital forensics experts. It was time to lay out everything they had. "All right, people," Harper began. "I think we need to seriously consider that Brandon and Ashley Hartwell weren't just the people who discovered their parents' bodies. I think they're the ones who created those bodies." He laid out the evidence. 1. The timeline. Cell phone tower data showed that Brandon's phone, his regular phone, not the burner, had pinged off a tower near the Hartwell residence at 9:43 p.m. on September 13th, right around the estimated time of the murders. But according to Brandon and Ashley's statements, they were at the party the entire evening. They shouldn't have been anywhere near their house until after 3 a.m. When I asked Brandon about this, he claimed he must have left his phone in the car and the tower data was just picking up weird signals, Harper said. But that doesn't explain why his phone pinged near the house and then pinged back near the lake house at 10:58 p.m. That's consistent with someone driving from the party to the house and back. 2. The physical evidence. The broken window, the glass pattern, the blood in the garage, the wet spots indicating cleanup, all of it suggested that whoever killed Thomas and Linda Hartwell had access to the house, knew the layout, and had time to stage the scene afterward. This wasn't a random home invasion, Harper said. This was someone who knew the family, knew when they'd be home alone, and knew how to make it look like a break-in. 3. The witness. Eric Paulson's testimony placed Brandon's car near a lake around 10:40 p.m. on the night of the murders, exactly when someone might be disposing of evidence. "We sent divers into that lake yesterday," Harper continued. "And guess what they found?" He held up an evidence bag containing a waterlogged laptop. Thomas Hartwell's laptop, still in its case, along with Linda's iPad, her jewelry, and about $800 in cash. All wrapped in a pillowcase that we've traced back to the Hartwell household. The room was silent. Everyone was processing what this meant. If this was a robbery gone wrong, why did the thief throw $800 in cash into a lake? Harper asked. Why dump a laptop and iPad that could have been sold for good money? The only reason to dispose of these items is if you didn't actually want them, if you were just taking them to make it look like robbery. 4. The burner phone. The digital forensics team had been working around the clock to extract data from the burner phone found in the storm drain. Maya Patel, the lead digital forensics specialist, stood up to present her findings. "We were able to recover substantial amounts of deleted data from this phone," Patel said. "Text messages, browsing history, app data. And what we found is, it's damning." She pulled up screenshots on the projector. Messages between the phone and Ashley's number. Messages planning the murders. Messages sent in the weeks and months leading up to September 13th. The apps were encrypted and deleted, but we found remnants of the data in the phone's cache, Patel explained. "We can't recover every message, but we got enough to establish a pattern." Brandon and Ashley Hartwell were planning to kill their parents for at least 6 months before the murders occurred. The district attorney, Janet Silverman, leaned forward. She was a sharp woman in her mid-40s, known for her aggressive prosecution style and her near-perfect conviction rate. How certain are we about this? I need to know we can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. Patel continued. In addition to the messages, we found extensive internet searches on both Brandon and Ashley's devices. Searches for how to commit murder without getting caught, forensic investigation techniques, inheritance law for minors, emancipated minors and estates. I have a 40-page report documenting everything we found. Silverman nodded slowly. And the Google Doc? The one you mentioned in your preliminary report. Project Freedom, Patel confirmed. We recovered it from Ashley's Google Drive cloud storage. She thought she deleted it, but Google keeps deleted items for 30 days. It's all there. A step-by-step plan for murdering Thomas and Linda Hartwell. Harper looked around the room. So here's where we are. We have motive, the $42 million inheritance. We have means, they had access to the house and weapons. We have opportunity, they snuck away from the party during the window when the murders occurred. And we have evidence of planning, evidence of their presence at the scene, and evidence of disposing of stolen items. Silverman stood up. Then I think it's time we brought Brandon and Ashley Hartwell in for formal interviews. And I think we need to do it today before they lawyer up. At 2:47 p.m. on September 17th, Detective Harper and his partner, Detective Lisa Morrison, drove to the hotel where Brandon and Ashley had been staying since the murders. Their Aunt Patricia had come from out of state to care for them while funeral arrangements were being made. The teenagers had no idea that in the next few hours, their entire lives would change forever. Harper and Morrison arrived at the hotel at 3:12 p.m. They knocked on the door of room 217, where Patricia Monroe was staying with her niece and nephew. Patricia answered, her face drawn and exhausted from grief. Detectives? Is there news? Have you found who did this? Ms. Monroe, we need to speak with Brandon and Ashley. Formally down at the station. There are some inconsistencies in their statements that we need to clear up. Patricia's expression shifted from grief to worry. Inconsistencies? What do you mean? Are they in some kind of trouble? We just need to ask them some follow-up questions, Morrison said gently. It's standard procedure in any investigation. Brandon appeared behind his aunt. He'd aged years in the past 4 days. Dark circles under his eyes. Unkempt hair. The picture of a grieving son. What's going on? He asked. Brandon, we need you and your sister to come down to the station to answer some questions, Harper said. Something flickered across Brandon's face. Fear? Calculation? It was gone too quickly for Harper to be sure. Do we need a lawyer? Brandon asked. That question right there, that was the moment Harper knew for certain that Brandon was guilty. Innocent people don't immediately ask about lawyers. They ask what's wrong. They ask how they can help. They want to do anything possible to find their parents' killer. But Brandon's first instinct was to protect himself. That's up to you, Harper said carefully. You're not under arrest. You're not being charged with anything. We just have some questions. But yes, you have the right to an attorney if you want one. Brandon and Ashley exchanged a look. A long, meaningful look that spoke volumes. We'll come, Ashley said quietly. We want to help however we can. At 4:05 p.m., Brandon and Ashley arrived at the Springfield Oaks Police Department. They were separated immediately, Brandon taken to interview room 1, Ashley to interview room 2. The interrogations would last for hours. And by the end one of them would break. Detective Harper sat across from Brandon Hartwell in interview room 1. The room was deliberately uncomfortable, cold, stark, with just a metal table, 3 chairs, and a mirror that everyone knew was actually one-way glass. Miranda rights were read. Brandon waived his right to an attorney, a decision he would come to regret. Brandon, I want to start by saying that I understand you're going through an incredibly difficult time, Harper began, his voice sympathetic. Losing your parents like this, I can't imagine. But I need to ask you about some things that aren't adding up. Brandon nodded, his expression carefully neutral. Of course. Whatever you need. Harper pulled out a folder and opened it slowly, letting the tension build. Your cell phone pinged off a tower near your house at 9:43 p.m. on the night of the murders. But you told me you were at Justin Meyer's party all night. Can you explain that? Brandon didn't miss a beat. I must have left my phone in the car. Sometimes towers pick up weird signals. Harper made a note. Except your phone then pinged near the lake house at 10:58 p.m. That's consistent with someone driving from your house back to the party. How do you explain that? Brandon's jaw tightened slightly. I don't know. I don't understand how cell towers work. Maybe someone moved my car. Who would move your car, Brandon? I don't know. I'm telling you, I was at the party. Harper leaned back, studying him. Okay, let's talk about something else. We found some items in a lake about 5 miles from the party. Your father's laptop, your mother's iPad, some jewelry. Can you think of any reason why those items would be in that lake? Brandon's face went pale. No, I don't know. Here's the interesting thing, Harper continued. A witness saw someone throw a pillowcase into that lake around 10:40 p.m. on September 13th. And that witness wrote down the license plate of the car he saw. Brandon was very still now. Too still. It was your license plate, Brandon? That's impossible, Brandon said, but his voice was shaking now. I was at the party. Everyone saw me at the party. Were you at the party the entire night? Because we've been interviewing the other attendees and several people noticed you disappeared for a couple of hours. You and Ashley. Where did you go? We went for a drive. Family stuff. Private stuff. During which your phone pinged near your house, during which someone with your license plate threw evidence into a lake, during which your parents were murdered in their living room. Harper leaned forward. Brandon, I think you know what happened. I think you were there. And I think carrying this secret is eating you alive. You loved your parents, didn't you? Despite everything. And there, just for a second, Brandon's carefully constructed mask cracked. His eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean, it wasn't supposed to. Then he caught himself. Shut down completely. I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything else. Harper nodded. He hadn't gotten a full confession, but he'd gotten something almost as good. He'd gotten Brandon to reveal that he knew more than he was saying. Meanwhile, in interview room 2, Detective Lisa Morrison was having a very different conversation with Ashley Hartwell. Ashley was crying when Morrison entered. She'd been crying almost non-stop since the murders. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked much younger than 16, fragile, broken, childlike. Morrison's approach was different from Harper's. Where Harper was direct and confrontational, Morrison was maternal and sympathetic. Ashley, sweetie, I know how hard this is, Morrison said gently, sitting across from her. I'm a mother myself. I have a daughter about your age. And I can't imagine what you're going through. Ashley looked up, desperate for any kind of compassion or understanding. I loved them, Ashley whispered. I loved my mom so much. I know you did. I can see that. Which is why I'm so confused about some things we've found. Morrison pulled out printouts of the messages between Brandon and Ashley. Ashley, we recovered these from a phone we found. Messages between you and Brandon. Messages about planning something. Can you explain these to me? Ashley's face went white as she read them. I don't, those aren't. Ashley, look at me. Morrison's voice was firm but kind. I think you're a good person who got caught up in something terrible. I think Brandon pushed you into this. He's older, he's more manipulative, he knew how to get you to go along with it. This was his plan, wasn't it? Ashley's breathing was rapid now, panicked. I think you loved your parents and you didn't want any of this to happen, Morrison continued. But Brandon, he had that gambling debt. He was desperate. And he convinced you that this was the only way. Am I right? I didn't, I couldn't, I tried to stop him. You tried to stop him? Morrison leaned in. Tell me what happened, Ashley. Tell me the truth. This is your chance to explain your side. Because right now, all the evidence makes it look like you and Brandon planned this together. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think you're a victim here too. And that's when Ashley broke. I didn't want to do it, she sobbed. It was Brandon's idea. He planned everything. I told him I couldn't, I told him I loved Mom, but he said we had to do it. He said it was the only way we'd ever be free. Morrison's heart rate spiked, but she kept her voice calm. Okay, Ashley. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. From the beginning. And I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you do that? Ashley nodded, tears streaming down her face. And then she confessed to everything. What followed was a 2-hour confession that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Ashley Hartwell, 16 years old, sitting in interview room 2, confessed to her role in the murders of Thomas and Linda Hartwell. I'm going to walk you through the key parts of that confession now. These are Ashley's own words, recorded and later transcribed for trial. It started back in February, Ashley said, her voice small and broken. Brandon was getting into trouble with gambling. He owed so much money and Dad found out. Dad was so angry. He told Brandon he might not pay for Cornell. Brandon was freaking out. He kept saying his whole life was ruined. Morrison handed Ashley a tissue. Keep going. Brandon started talking about how much easier our lives would be if we had access to the inheritance. At first, I thought he was just venting, like wishful thinking. But then he kept bringing it up, more and more. And then one day he asked me if I'd ever thought about what it would be like if Mom and Dad just weren't around anymore. What did you say? Morrison asked. I said I didn't want to talk about it. It felt wrong. But Brandon wouldn't let it go. He started showing me articles about kids who inherited money young, about emancipated minors, about how we could live our lives however we wanted if we just had the money. Ashley's voice dropped to barely a whisper. And I started thinking about it, about not having to ask permission for everything, about not living under their rules, about being able to do what I wanted, by what I wanted, be who I wanted to be. It started as a fantasy, Ashley continued, just imagining. But then Brandon started researching. He found out about the will, about how we'd inherit everything. And he asked me, what if we could make it happen? And you said yes, Morrison stated. Ashley nodded miserably. I said yes. God help me, I said yes. We started planning in March. Brandon created that Google document. We researched everything. How to make it look like a robbery. How to avoid leaving evidence. We planned every detail. Tell me about September 13th, Morrison prompted. Tell me what happened that night. Ashley took a shaky breath. We went to the party like we said. We made sure lots of people saw us. We posted on Instagram. We played beer pong. We acted normal. And then at 9 o'clock we left. We told each other this was it. No going back. We drove to our house. We parked a few blocks away. We walked there. Brandon had a backpack with gloves and trash bags. We went in through the back door. We knew Mom and Dad would be watching TV. They always watch TV on Friday nights. Her voice broke completely. We went to the kitchen. Brandon took out the knives. He handed me one. I was shaking so bad. I kept thinking about Mom. About how she'd hugged me that morning. About how she'd said she loved me. What happened next, Ashley? We went to the living room. Mom and Dad were on the couch together. They looked so peaceful. So happy. And I froze. I couldn't do it. I couldn't hurt my mom. Brandon looked at me. He whispered now, but I couldn't move. So he just went ahead. He crossed the room and he stabbed Dad. Just stabbed him. And Dad looked so confused. He didn't understand what was happening. He said Brandon's name and then Brandon just kept stabbing him. Morrison remained silent, letting Ashley continue. Mom started screaming. She was screaming for Dad, screaming for Brandon to stop. She tried to help Dad, but Brandon turned on her. And I locked the front door. I didn't help her. I didn't call 911. I didn't do anything to save her. I just locked the door so she couldn't escape. Mom fought. She fought so hard. She was trying to protect herself, trying to get away. She kept saying, Brandon, please, I'm your mother, please. But he didn't stop. He just kept. Ashley couldn't continue. She was sobbing too hard. Morrison gave her a moment, then asked gently, how long did it take? I don't know. Maybe 10 minutes? It felt like hours. When it was over, there was blood everywhere. Mom and Dad were on the floor. They weren't moving. And Brandon just stood there, covered in blood, breathing hard. I started freaking out. I was crying, hyperventilating. Brandon told me to pull myself together. He said we had to finish the plan. We had to stage the robbery and get back to the party. Ashley detailed the rest. The ransacking of the master bedroom, the breaking of the back door window, the stolen items, the cleanup in the garage, disposing of evidence in the lake, returning to the party. When we got back to the party, I went to the bathroom and just stared at myself in the mirror, Ashley said. I kept thinking, you just killed your mother. Not Brandon. Me. I was just as responsible. I could have stopped it. I could have called for help. But I didn't. I chose this. Morrison let that statement hang in the air. Why did you do it, Ashley? Help me understand. Ashley was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. I wanted the money. I wanted the freedom. I wanted to not be their daughter anymore. I wanted to be my own person with my own life. And I thought it would be worth it. I thought once it was over, we'd have everything we ever wanted. And now? Morrison asked. Was it worth it? Ashley's face crumpled. No. God, no. I'd give anything, to take it back. I'd live under their rules forever. I'd never complain again. I'd give up every penny. I just want my mom back. I want to tell her I'm sorry. She couldn't continue. Morrison reached across the table and gently took Ashley's hand. "I know you do, sweetie. I know you do." The confession was over. Ashley had just confessed to participating in the murder of her own parents. In the room next door, Detective Harper and DA Silverman had been watching on a monitor. They had everything they needed. At 6:47 p.m. on September 17, 2019, Brandon and Ashley Hartwell were formally arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrests of Brandon and Ashley Hartwell made national news within hours. The story that had been a tragic tale of orphan teenagers suddenly became something much darker and more sensational. Teens charged in murder of parents for inheritance. Connecticut siblings arrested, allegedly killed parents for $42 million. From victims to suspects, the shocking twist in the Hartwell murder case. Public opinion shifted violently. The same people who had donated to the GoFundMe, who had expressed sympathy on social media, who had called Brandon and Ashley victims, they now called them monsters. The hashtag Justice for the Hartwells hashtag took on a new meaning. Now it meant justice against the Hartwells, not for them. Brandon and Ashley were held without bail. The DA argued, successfully, that they were flight risks with access to substantial resources and had already demonstrated a willingness to commit cold-blooded murder. They were separated and housed in different facilities. Brandon, being 18, was placed in adult detention. Ashley, at 16, was initially placed in a juvenile facility but would later be transferred when the DA successfully argued she should be tried as an adult. The legal proceedings were about to begin, and they would captivate the nation for the next year. The trial of Brandon and Ashley Hartwell began on March 2, 2020. It was held in Hartford Superior Court, presided over by Judge Margaret Thornton, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench. The case had been moved from Springfield Oaks due to extensive pretrial publicity. Finding an impartial jury had been nearly impossible, but eventually 12 jurors and 4 alternates were selected. District Attorney Janet Silverman stood to deliver her opening statement. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with media, spectators, true crime enthusiasts, and family members of the victims. Thomas and Linda's extended family, siblings, cousins, friends, filled 3 rows on the prosecution's side. They stared at Brandon and Ashley with expressions ranging from grief to fury to utter incomprehension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Silverman began, her voice clear and strong. "Over the next several weeks, you're going to hear a story that will disturb you. A story that will challenge everything you believe about the bonds between parents and children. A story about greed, manipulation, and cold-blooded murder." She turned to look directly at Brandon and Ashley, who sat at the defense table flanked by their attorneys. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell had everything. Loving parents, financial security, bright futures. But they wanted more. They wanted freedom from their parents' expectations. They wanted immediate access to a $42 million inheritance. And they were willing to kill to get it. Silverman walked to a screen where she projected the now infamous Christmas photo from 2018, the Hartwell family, smiling, happy, together. Thomas and Linda Hartwell were good people. Not perfect, no one is perfect. But they were good parents who loved their children and wanted the best for them. Thomas worked his way up from poverty to build an empire. Linda dedicated her life to raising Brandon and Ashley and serving her community. The next image was from the crime scene. The courtroom gasped. Some jury members looked away. This is how their children thanked them. On September 13, 2019, Brandon and Ashley Hartwell brutally murdered their parents in their own living room. 17 stab wounds for Thomas. 23 for Linda. They died in agony, betrayed by the children they loved more than anything in the world. Silverman spent the next hour laying out the prosecution's case. The motive, inheritance and freedom from parental control. The planning. 6 months of research, encrypted messages, detailed planning documents. The execution. Leaving the party, driving to the house, committing the murders. The cover-up. Staging the scene, disposing of evidence, returning to establish an alibi. The confession. Ashley's detailed admission of everything that happened. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, Silverman concluded. You will hear from forensic experts, from witnesses, from investigators. You will see the messages they sent. You will read the plans they made. You will watch Ashley Hartwell's confession where she admits, in her own words, to participating in her parents' murders. She paused, looking at each juror in turn. At the end of this trial, I will stand before you again and ask you to deliver the only just verdict in this case. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of betraying every bond of love and trust. Guilty of ending 2 beautiful lives for nothing more than money and selfishness. Thomas and Linda Hartwell cannot speak for themselves anymore. Their voices were silenced by their own children. But you 12 people, can speak for them. You can deliver justice. Thank you. It was a powerful opening statement. Several jury members were visibly emotional. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. But now it was the defense's turn. Marcus Holbrook stood to deliver the opening statement for Brandon's defense. He was a high-powered criminal defense attorney from Boston, known for taking on impossible cases and occasionally winning them. Ashley's attorney, Diane Porter, would deliver her own separate statement afterward. The siblings' defense strategies were coordinated but distinct, each trying to minimize their own client's culpability while subtly shifting blame. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holbrook began, his voice measured and thoughtful, "the prosecution wants you to see this as a simple case. Greedy children kill their parents for money. Open and shut. But nothing in life is that simple. And this case certainly isn't." He walked toward the jury box, making eye contact with several jurors. Brandon Hartwell is an 18-year-old kid. A kid who grew up under intense pressure from a father who demanded perfection. Thomas Hartwell was successful. No one disputes that. But success came at a cost. And that cost was paid by his family. Holbrook projected an image of Thomas at one of Brandon's lacrosse games. You could see Thomas in the stands, his face contorted in frustration. This is what Brandon saw from his father. Disappointment. Anger when he didn't perform perfectly. Thomas Hartwell loved his son, but he loved his idea of what his son should be even more. He wanted Brandon to be a mini version of himself. Driven, perfect, successful. But Brandon wasn't Thomas. He was his own person. And that was never good enough. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Some of Thomas's family members shook their heads in disgust at this characterization. When Brandon made a mistake, when he developed a gambling problem as many young people do, his father's response wasn't to get him help. It wasn't to show compassion. It was to threaten to destroy his future. To cut him off. To make him pay back every penny. Thomas Hartwell chose punishment over support. Holbrook let that sink in. Now, does that justify what happened? No, absolutely not. But it helps explain it. Brandon was a kid under enormous pressure, with crushing debt, facing the destruction of everything he'd worked for. He wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't acting rationally. He was desperate. The prosecution wants you to believe that Brandon coldly planned his parents' murder for 6 months. But what the evidence actually shows is a troubled young man spiraling out of control, making terrible decisions, and ultimately committing an act he will regret for the rest of his life. Holbrook addressed the confession and evidence head-on. You'll hear Ashley Hartwell's confession. And yes, Brandon was there that night. He doesn't deny it. But listen carefully to what Ashley says. Who planned everything? Brandon. Who did the actual killing? Brandon. Ashley couldn't do it. She froze. Because despite everything, she loved her mother. Brandon is guilty of terrible crimes. We don't dispute that. But this wasn't a calculated execution by a cold-blooded killer. This was a desperate act by a troubled teenager who saw no other way out. And that distinction matters under the law. Holbrook sat down. It was a risky strategy, essentially admitting guilt while arguing for a lesser degree of culpability. But with the evidence against Brandon, denial wasn't an option. Diane Porter stood for Ashley's defense. Her strategy was different. She would try to paint Ashley as a victim of her brother's manipulation. Ashley Hartwell was 16 years old, Porter began. 16. Still a child by law and by any reasonable standard. And she was groomed, manipulated, and coerced by her older brother into participating in something she never would have conceived of on her own. Porter projected photos of Ashley, cheerleading with friends, volunteer work at the animal shelter. This is who Ashley was. A good kid. Honor student. Volunteer. Someone who cared about others. Does this look like a killer to you? Ashley fell under Brandon's influence. He was older, more confident, more manipulative. He planted ideas in her head. He made murder seem like the only solution to their problems. He researched. He planned. He pushed her forward every time she hesitated. Porter's voice rose with emotion. And when the moment came, when they were standing in that living room, Ashley couldn't do it. She froze. Because she loved her mother. Because despite everything Brandon had told her, despite all the planning, she couldn't bring herself to hurt the woman who raised her. Did Ashley make terrible choices? Yes. Should she have called 911? Absolutely. But she was a child, terrified, under the influence of her manipulative brother. She wasn't thinking clearly. She was in a dissociative state, essentially in shock. Porter concluded, Ashley Hartwell is not a murderer. She's a victim of her brother's manipulation and her own poor judgment. She deserves compassion, rehabilitation, and a chance at redemption, not to be treated as a cold-blooded killer. The battle lines were drawn. The prosecution argued premeditated first-degree murder by both siblings. Brandon's defense argued diminished capacity and extreme emotional disturbance. Ashley's defense argued she was a manipulated minor who didn't actually kill anyone. Over the next 6 weeks, the jury would hear from dozens of witnesses, examine hundreds of pieces of evidence, and ultimately decide the fate of Brandon and Ashley Hartwell. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. They called 43 witnesses, entered 247 pieces of evidence, and built an overwhelming case for premeditated murder. Let me walk you through some of the most impactful testimony. The first week focused on the physical evidence and the crime scene itself. Dr. William Chin, the medical examiner, provided graphic testimony about Thomas and Linda's injuries. Crime scene photos were shown, photos so disturbing that several jurors looked away, and 2 spectators had to leave the courtroom. The violence inflicted on these victims was extreme, Dr. Chin testified. The number of wounds, 17 for Mr. Hartwell, 23 for Mrs. Hartwell, indicates sustained attacks. These weren't quick killings. The victims suffered. The defensive wounds on Linda's hands and arms were particularly heartbreaking. Dr. Chin explained that she'd been conscious and fighting for her life for several minutes. Mrs. Hartwell tried desperately to protect herself. The wounds on her palms and forearms show she was attempting to grab the blade, to block the attacks. She was aware of what was happening to her. Cross-examination by the defense tried to establish that the violence indicated a loss of control, unplanned rage rather than calculated murder. But Silverman countered on redirect. Dr. Chin, in your expert opinion, does the level of violence change whether the murder was premeditated? No, Dr. Chin replied. Premeditated murders can be extremely violent. The planning is about the decision to kill. The execution can still be chaotic and brutal. Crime scene investigator Maria Santos testified about the staged break-in and the evidence found in the garage. The broken window, the damaged door frame, these were done to make it look like forced entry, Santos explained. But the forensic evidence didn't support an intruder. There were no foreign fingerprints. No mud or dirt tracked in from outside. And we found blood evidence in the garage indicating someone cleaned themselves there after the murders. The defense tried to argue that the blood evidence was consistent with the children checking on their parents before calling 911. But Santos shut that down. The blood in the garage utility sink was diluted with water and cleaning agents. Someone washed blood off their person. That's not consistent with checking on victims. That's consistent with cleanup after committing a violent crime. The second week was devastating for the defense. Digital forensics specialist Maya Patel walked the jury through months of electronic evidence. The encrypted messages between Brandon and Ashley were entered into evidence and read aloud in court. Hearing the actual words, the casual way they discussed murdering their parents, shocked the courtroom. Brandon, how much do you think we'll get from the estate? Ashley, millions. Enough to never worry about money again. Brandon, worth it? Ashley, definitely worth it. The Google Doc, Project Freedom, was displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. Jurors read through the methodical planning, the checklist, the research. One juror was seen shaking her head in disbelief. The defense tried to argue that fantasy and planning weren't the same as intent, that teenagers often engage in dark hypotheticals without meaning them. But the prosecution demolished that argument by showing the progression, from fantasy in February to concrete planning in March to purchase of supplies in September to execution on September 13th. This wasn't fantasy, Silverman argued. This was a detailed, methodical plan that was carried out exactly as written. That's premeditation. That's first-degree murder. Cell phone records placed Brandon's phone near the Hartwell house during the time of the murders. Tower data showed the phone traveling from the party to the house and back. Brandon's defense argued that he'd left his phone in the car and the data was misleading. But the prosecution brought in a cellular technology expert who explained, the pattern of tower connections is consistent with a device in motion, in a car traveling on roads, not a stationary device sitting in a parking lot. The phone was moving along the route from the Meyer Lake house to the Hartwell residence and back. The third week opened with Ashley's videotaped confession being played for the jury. For 2 hours, the courtroom watched 16-year-old Ashley Hartwell describe in detail how she and her brother murdered their parents. Many people in the courtroom were crying by the end, including some jurors. Ashley's confession was damning for both defendants. She implicated Brandon as the planner and killer, but she also admitted her own participation, her own choices, her own willingness to let her mother die. The defense tried to argue that Ashley's confession was coerced, that she'd been interrogated for hours without a lawyer. But Judge Thornton shut that down. Ms. Hartwell was read her Miranda rights. She waived her right to an attorney voluntarily. Detective Morrison's questioning was well within legal bounds. The confession stands. Witnesses from the party testified about Brandon and Ashley's disappearance that night. They were definitely gone for like 2 hours, Justin Meyer testified. I remember because I was looking for Brandon to play another round of beer pong, and someone said he'd left. I thought it was weird. Melissa Kowalski testified about Ashley's behavior when she returned. She seemed off. Anxious. She'd changed clothes. When I asked her about it, she had an explanation, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. Eric Paulson, the jogger who'd seen the car at the lake, testified about writing down the license plate. It was around 10:40 p.m. I saw a car pull up, 2 people get out, and one of them threw something into the lake. It seemed suspicious, so I made a note of the plate. I never thought it would be connected to a murder. The prosecution played the 911 call Brandon had made when they discovered the bodies. To the untrained ear, Brandon sounded genuinely distressed. But the prosecution brought in a forensic psychologist who specialized in analyzing emergency calls. Mr. Hartwell's distress sounds authentic, but there are indicators that suggest performance rather than genuine shock, the expert testified. His breathing is controlled. His speech is too organized for someone in true panic. And notice how quickly he establishes the robbery narrative. The back door looks like someone broke in. That's not typical of someone who just discovered a crime scene. The defense objected vigorously to this testimony, arguing it was junk science. But Judge Thornton allowed it, giving it appropriate weight for jury consideration. By the end of the 3rd week, the prosecution rested its case. They'd proven motive, means, and opportunity. They'd shown planning and premeditation. They'd presented Ashley's confession. They'd demolished any alternative explanation for the evidence. It was now the defense's turn to present their case. And they had an uphill battle. The defense had a nearly impossible task, not to prove innocence, that ship had sailed, but to create enough doubt about premeditation and mental state to get a conviction on a lesser charge. Brandon's defense called several witnesses to testify about Thomas Hartwell's demanding nature and the pressure Brandon had been under. Sarah Mitchell, Brandon's ex-girlfriend, testified about Brandon's complaints about his father. Brandon felt like he could never live up to his dad's expectations, Sarah said. He told me his dad cared more about success than about him as a person. He felt trapped. The prosecution countered on cross-examination. Did Brandon ever tell you he was planning to murder his father? No, of course not. Did he ever say he felt physically unsafe at home? No. So his response to feeling pressure was to complain to his girlfriend? Not to seek help from counselors, therapists, or other family members? I guess so. The defense brought in Dr. Harold Chin, a forensic psychiatrist, to testify about Brandon's mental state. Brandon was suffering from acute stress and anxiety related to his gambling debt and his fear of disappointing his father, Dr. Chin testified. When people are in extreme psychological distress, their decision-making capabilities are compromised. They may engage in behaviors they normally wouldn't consider. But on cross-examination, Silverman destroyed this argument. Dr. Chin, you've reviewed the evidence showing that Brandon planned these murders for 6 months. 6 months of research, preparation, and methodical planning. Does that sound like someone who's acting impulsively due to acute stress? Dr. Chin hesitated. The planning could be seen as a coping mechanism. Does 6 months of detailed planning indicate impaired judgment or very calculated judgment? It's calculated. But the underlying decision could still be driven by psychological distress. But not so much distress that he couldn't function normally, attend school, maintain relationships, and carry out a complex murder plot? Dr. Chin had no good answer. Ashley's defense took a different approach, focusing heavily on her age and her brother's influence. Several of Ashley's friends testified that she'd always looked up to Brandon, that she'd been easily influenced by him. Ashley kind of lived in Brandon's shadow, Melissa Kowalski testified. She always wanted his approval. If Brandon thought something was cool, Ashley thought it was cool. The defense brought in Dr. Rebecca Sandoval, an expert in adolescent psychology and coercion. The adolescent brain, particularly in girls, is still developing in the areas responsible for judgment and impulse control, Dr. Sandoval testified. Ashley was 16. She was susceptible to influence from authority figures, and older siblings can function as authority figures. Dr. Sandoval continued, when we look at the evidence, we see that Brandon was clearly the dominant personality. He did the planning. He purchased supplies. He was the one who actually committed the killings. Ashley's role was passive. She froze when the moment came because her natural empathy overrode the influence her brother had exerted. But Silverman was ready. Dr. Sandoval, you say Ashley's role was passive. But didn't she lock the front door to prevent her mother from escaping? Yes, but... And didn't she help stage the crime scene afterward? Yes, but that could be explained by... And didn't she spend months actively participating in planning discussions, research, and preparation? Yes, Dr. Sandoval admitted. But teenagers, especially under the influence of older siblings? Dr. Sandoval, at what age does a person become responsible for choosing not to murder their parents? 17? 18? 21. The question hung in the air. Dr. Sandoval had no good answer. The defense's most controversial move was putting Brandon on the stand. It was a huge risk. Defendants who testify open themselves up to cross-examination. But Holbrook felt they had no choice. They needed the jury to see Brandon as a human being, not a monster. Brandon Hartwell took the stand on day 23 of the trial. Brandon had cleaned up for his testimony. Gone was the disheveled, defeated appearance from earlier in the trial. He wore a suit. His hair was neatly cut. He looked young, vulnerable, more like a scared college kid than a cold-blooded killer. His attorney, Marcus Holbrook, approached him gently. Brandon, can you tell the jury about your relationship with your father? Brandon's voice was soft, hesitant. My dad was complicated. He loved me, I know he did. But he also had very specific ideas about who I should be, what I should accomplish. And I spent my whole life trying to live up to those expectations. Did you feel pressure from him? Constant pressure. It was like nothing I did was ever enough. I'd get an A- and he'd ask why it wasn't an A. I'd score 2 goals in a lacrosse game and he'd focus on the one shot I missed. It was exhausting. Holbrook led Brandon through his testimony carefully. The gambling problem, the debt, his father's reaction, his spiraling anxiety. I felt trapped, Brandon said. I owed almost $50,000. My dad threatened to cut me off. I thought my entire future was ruined. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was having panic attacks. Is that when you started thinking about the inheritance? Brandon nodded slowly. I started thinking that if I had access to the inheritance, all my problems would go away. I wouldn't have debt. I wouldn't have to worry about money. I could live my life without my dad controlling every aspect of it. And when did those thoughts turn into plans? I don't know exactly. It was gradual. At first it was just fantasy, I guess. Wishful thinking. But then I started researching, looking into how inheritance law works. And I started talking to Ashley about it. Holbrook showed Brandon some of the encrypted messages. Are these your messages? Yes. You were discussing killing your parents. These weren't fantasies at this point, were they? Brandon's eyes filled with tears. No, they weren't. I was serious. I was planning it. And I hate myself for it every single day. Tell the jury about September 13th. What happened that night? Brandon took a shaky breath. We went to the party like we planned. Everything was going according to plan. But as we were driving to the house, I started thinking about my dad. About how he taught me to ride a bike. How he'd come to all my games. How proud he'd been when I got into Cornell. But you didn't turn around. No, I thought about it. But I'd already made the decision. I'd already committed to it. And I felt like I couldn't go back. Brandon described entering the house, going to the living room, seeing his parents on the couch. They looked so peaceful. So happy together. And I thought, what am I doing? But then I thought about the debt, the pressure, everything I'd been through. And I snapped. I crossed the room and I stabbed my dad. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't thinking at all. I was just acting on all this rage and fear and desperation that had been building up for months. What happened with your mother? She started screaming. She was trying to help my dad. And I turned on her. I killed her too. I killed my own mother. Brandon was crying openly now. I killed both my parents. The people who loved me most in the world. The people who gave me everything. And I can never take it back. I have to live with what I did for the rest of my life. Holbrook let that moment sit with the jury. Several jurors looked sympathetic. Others looked unmoved. Do you take full responsibility for what happened? Yes. It was my plan. My decision. Ashley didn't want to do it. I pushed her into it. If anyone should be punished, it's me. It was a strategic move, taking full responsibility while subtly suggesting his sister should be treated more leniently. But now came the part that defense attorneys dread: cross-examination. District Attorney Janet Silverman approached the witness stand with a predatory gleam in her eye. She'd been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Hartwell," Silverman began, her voice sharp and clear. "You just told this jury that you snapped on the night of September 13th. Is that correct?" "Yes." "You snapped, lost control, acted in a moment of rage?" "Yes." "Then explain to me how someone who snapped managed to execute a plan they've been working on for 6 months. Brandon stammered. It was. You didn't snap, did you, Mr. Hartwell? You did exactly what you'd planned to do. You went to that party to establish an alibi. You left at the exact time you'd planned. You drove to your house on the route you'd practiced. You retrieved weapons from the kitchen as you'd planned. You killed your parents as you'd planned. You staged the scene as you'd planned. You disposed of evidence as you'd planned. Does that sound like someone who snapped?" "I planned it, but when it actually happened..." "When it actually happened, you carried out your plan perfectly. Isn't that the truth?" "I guess so." Silverman pulled out Brandon's own messages. "Let me read some of your words, Mr. Hartwell. March 15th, you wrote to Ashley, 'We have to be smart about this. No mistakes. If we do it right, we'll never get caught.' Does that sound like someone planning to snap?" "No." April 22nd. "The key is making it look random. Like a robbery. We can't leave any evidence that points to us. Does that sound like rage?" "No." May 8th. "Once this is over, we'll be free. Rich and free. It'll all be worth it." Does that sound like desperation, or does it sound like greed? Brandon's voice was barely audible. "Greed." Silverman pulled up the Google Doc on the courtroom screens. "You created a detailed planning document titled Project Freedom. You organized it with sections, timelines, and checklists. You color-coded it. Does this look like the work of someone who's not thinking clearly?" Brandon stared at the screen, unable to respond. "Answer the question, Mr. Hartwell." "No, it doesn't." Silverman moved closer to the witness stand. "You told this jury that you felt trapped by your father's expectations. But you weren't trapped, were you? You were 18 years old. You were going to college. You could have walked away from your family at any time. It wasn't that simple." "Why not? You're an adult. You could have gotten a job, supported yourself, made your own choices. Isn't that right?" "Theoretically, but you wanted the money. You wanted the inheritance. And you didn't want to wait 7 years to get it." Brandon's facade was cracking. "Yes, I wanted the money." "And you were willing to murder your parents to get it?" "Yes." Silverman paused, letting that admission hang in the air. "You testified that you have to live with what you did for the rest of your life. But that's not quite accurate, is it? Because if you're convicted of first-degree murder, you'll likely spend the rest of your life in prison. That's what you're trying to avoid here, isn't it? By claiming you snapped, by expressing remorse, you're hoping this jury will give you a lighter sentence." Brandon's attorney started to object, but Silverman withdrew the question before the judge could rule. "Let's talk about your mother, Mr. Hartwell. Linda Hartwell. What did she do to you that warranted 23 stab wounds?" "Nothing. My mom didn't do anything." "She loved you unconditionally, didn't she?" "Yes." "She supported you, encouraged you, celebrated your successes?" "Yes." "She never pressured you the way your father did?" "No, she didn't." "So why did you kill her, Mr. Hartwell? If your father was the problem, why did Linda have to die?" Brandon's face crumpled. "Because she was there. Because she saw what happened to my dad. Because she would have." He stopped himself, realizing what he was about to say. "Because she would have what? Called the police? Testified against you?" "Because she was a witness who had to be eliminated." "Yes," he whispered. "So you murdered your mother, a woman who never hurt you, who only showed you love, because she was a witness. That's not snapping, Mr. Hartwell. That's calculated. That's cold-blooded. That's first-degree murder." Silverman turned to the jury. "You heard him, ladies and gentlemen. He murdered his mother because she was a witness." His own words. She turned back to Brandon. "You mentioned that Ashley didn't want to do it, that you pushed her into it. But Ashley testified, in her confession, that she spent months planning this with you. She researched murder methods. She discussed the inheritance. She agreed to the plan. She was a willing participant until the moment came to actually stab someone. Isn't that true?" "I guess so." "There's no guessing, Mr. Hartwell. Either she was a willing participant in planning these murders or she wasn't. Which is it? She was willing. Thank you. No further questions. Brandon's testimony had been a disaster for the defense. Instead of humanizing him and creating sympathy, cross-examination had revealed him as manipulative, calculating, and remorseless beneath a thin veneer of tears. Several jurors were staring at him with expressions of disgust. The defense rested shortly after Brandon's testimony concluded. They'd done everything they could, but it hadn't been enough. Ashley's defense chose not to put her on the stand. Her confession had already said everything there was to say, and her attorney, Diane Porter, didn't want to risk a similar cross-examination disaster. Instead, Porter focused her closing argument on Ashley's age, her susceptibility to Brandon's influence, and the fact that she hadn't physically harmed anyone. Ashley Hartwell made terrible choices, Porter argued. She participated in planning. She went along with the scheme. She failed to stop it. But when the moment came, when she was supposed to actually hurt her mother, she couldn't do it. That hesitation, that inability to commit violence even after months of planning, shows that she still had a conscience. Still had humanity. Ashley is guilty of something. But not first-degree murder. She didn't kill anyone. She didn't strike a single blow. At most, she's an accomplice, someone who made terrible decisions but didn't actually commit violence. And she deserves to be punished accordingly. It was a reasonable argument. But the prosecution had powerful counterarguments ready. After 6 weeks of testimony, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and dozens of witnesses, the trial was coming to its conclusion. It was time for closing arguments, each side's final chance to persuade the jury. District Attorney Janet Silverman stood to deliver the prosecution's closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the past 6 weeks you've heard a lot of testimony. You've seen disturbing evidence. You've listened to explanations and excuses. But at the end of the day, this case comes down to something very simple. 2 children murdered their parents for money. She walked to the center of the courtroom. Thomas and Linda Hartwell loved their children. They provided for them. They wanted the best for them. Yes, Thomas had high expectations. Yes, he could be demanding. But he was trying to teach his son discipline and responsibility. He was trying to ensure Brandon didn't squander the opportunities he'd been given. Were Thomas and Linda perfect parents? No. No parent is perfect. But they didn't deserve to be stabbed to death in their own living room. They didn't deserve to die in terror and agony, betrayed by the children they loved. Silverman's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell want you to believe they're victims. Victims of pressure. Victims of high expectations. Victims of their own youth and poor judgment. But the evidence tells a different story. She began counting on her fingers. They planned these murders for 6 months. That's not a snap decision. They researched murder methods and forensic techniques. That's not poor judgment. They purchased supplies. They practiced the route. They created detailed planning documents with checklists and timelines. That's not the work of confused teenagers. That's cold, calculated premeditation. They lured their parents into a false sense of security. They had dinner with them that night. They hugged them goodbye. They told them they loved them. All while knowing they'd be coming back in a few hours to kill them. That's not youthful impulsiveness. That's sociopathic manipulation. Silverman pointed at Brandon and Ashley at the defense table. They want you to believe that Brandon acted alone and Ashley was just along for the ride. But Ashley's own words, in her own confession, tell us the truth. She participated in planning. She researched. She agreed. She went to that house knowing what was going to happen. And when her mother was being murdered, she locked the door to prevent escape. The defense argues that Ashley didn't physically kill anyone. But under Connecticut law, if you participate in a felony murder, if you're there, if you're helping, if you're enabling, you're guilty of murder. Full stop. Ashley Hartwell is just as guilty as her brother. Silverman approached the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. Brandon Hartwell stabbed his father 17 times. He stabbed his mother 23 times. He looked into their eyes as they died. He heard them beg for mercy. And he kept stabbing. After the murders, did he call 911? Did he break down in remorse? No. He calmly staged a crime scene. He disposed of evidence. He returned to a party and played beer pong. He posted on social media. He acted like nothing had happened. And when police arrived hours later, he played the role of grieving son. He fake cried on cue. He gave them a cover story. He tried to get away with it. Silverman returned to her table and picked up a thick binder. You've heard all the evidence. You've seen the messages. You've watched the confession. You've heard from experts. And all of it, every single piece, points to the same conclusion. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell committed first-degree murder. Premeditated. Intentional. Calculated. She paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Thomas and Linda Hartwell can't speak for themselves. They can't tell you how much they loved their children. They can't tell you how they tried to be good parents. They can't tell you how terrified they were in their final moments. But you can speak for them. You can deliver justice. You can tell these defendants that in our society, you don't get to murder your parents because they had expectations. You don't get to murder your parents because you want their money. You don't get to murder your parents and walk away with anything less than the most serious consequences our legal system can provide. Silverman looked directly at the jury. When you deliberate, I want you to think about Thomas and Linda. Think about their last moments. Think about the terror they felt. Think about the betrayal. And then I want you to return the only verdict that justice demands: guilty of first-degree murder. Both defendants. On all counts. Thank you. It was a devastating closing argument. Several jurors were visibly emotional. Thomas and Linda's family members in the gallery were crying openly. Now it was the defense's turn. Marcus Holbrook stood for Brandon's closing argument. He knew he was fighting an uphill battle, but he had to try. Ladies and gentlemen, everything the prosecution just told you is designed to make you angry. To make you want revenge. To make you forget that we're talking about an 18-year-old kid who made the worst mistake of his life. Yes, Brandon Hartwell killed his parents. We're not disputing that. What we're disputing is the degree of culpability. The prosecution wants you to see a cold-blooded killer. But what you should see is a troubled young man who was drowning in pressure and debt and desperation. Holbrook walked to where Brandon sat, placing a hand on his shoulder. Brandon grew up in a household where love was conditional, where acceptance depended on performance, where nothing he did was ever good enough. That kind of psychological environment has effects. It damages people. It makes them desperate. The prosecution says 6 months of planning proves premeditation. But consider this, maybe those 6 months show how conflicted Brandon was. If he was truly a cold-blooded killer, why wait 6 months? Why agonize over it? Why have doubts? It was a weak argument and Holbrook knew it, but he pressed on. Brandon made terrible choices. He committed terrible acts. But he's not a monster. He's a kid who made a catastrophic mistake. And under Connecticut law, that distinction matters. The prosecution wants first-degree murder. But the evidence supports second-degree murder or manslaughter, crimes of passion, not calculated execution. When you deliberate, I ask you to consider Brandon's age, his state of mind, the pressure he was under. I ask you to consider that people can do terrible things in moments of desperation without being irredeemable monsters. I ask you to deliver a verdict that acknowledges his guilt but also acknowledges his humanity. Thank you. Holbrook sat down. It was clear from the jurors' faces that he hadn't moved them. But he'd done his job. He'd given Brandon a defense, even if it wasn't a winning one. Diane Porter stood for Ashley's closing argument. Her strategy was clearer: paint Ashley as a victim of her brother. Ashley Hartwell was 16 years old. 16. Still a child. And she fell under the influence of her older, more dominant brother. Brandon was the planner. Brandon was the killer. Brandon was the one who actually committed violence. Yes, Ashley participated in planning. Yes, she was there that night. Yes, she made terrible choices. But when the moment came, when she was supposed to hurt her mother, she couldn't do it. Her conscience stopped her. Her love for her mother was stronger than her brother's manipulation. Porter walked toward the jury. The prosecution wants you to treat a 16-year-old girl who didn't physically harm anyone the same as an 18-year-old man who committed 40 stab wounds. That's not justice. That's revenge. Ashley is guilty of being a foolish teenager, of being manipulated, of making bad choices. But she's not guilty of first-degree murder. She deserves punishment, yes, but she also deserves mercy. She deserves a chance at rehabilitation. She deserves to be treated as the child she was, not the monster the prosecution wants her to be. Porter concluded, when you deliberate, I ask you to see Ashley for who she really is. A 16-year-old girl who made terrible mistakes but who still has a conscience, still has humanity, and still deserves a chance at redemption. Thank you. The closing arguments were complete. Now it was time for Judge Thornton to instruct the jury on the law. Judge Margaret Thornton addressed the jury with her final instructions. She explained the charges, the legal standards for first-degree murder versus lesser charges, the burden of proof, and the requirement for unanimous verdicts. You must decide, based on the evidence and only the evidence, Whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Brandon and Ashley Hartwell committed first-degree murder, Judge Thornton explained. First-degree murder requires proof of premeditation, that the defendants thought about and planned the killings in advance. She continued, if you find that the prosecution has not proven premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt, you may consider lesser charges such as second-degree murder or manslaughter. You must consider each defendant separately. Your verdict for Brandon does not have to be the same as your verdict for Ashley. You must evaluate the evidence against each defendant independently. At 2:47 p.m. on April 17, 2020, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait began. Jury deliberations are always mysterious. No one knows what happens in that room except the 12 people deciding the fate of the accused. But we do know some facts about what occurred during the Hartwell jury deliberations, thanks to post-trial interviews with several jurors. The deliberations lasted 3 days, longer than most people expected given the overwhelming evidence. According to juror number 7, a retired teacher named Margaret Wu who spoke to the media after the trial, the jury was never divided on Brandon's guilt. We all agreed from the start that Brandon was guilty of first-degree murder, Wu said. The evidence was overwhelming. The planning, the execution, the cover-up, it was all there. There was no question. The first vote on Brandon's guilt was taken within an hour of beginning deliberations, 12-0 for guilty of first-degree murder on both counts. But Ashley's case was more complicated. We were split on Ashley, Wu explained. Some of us felt she was just as guilty as Brandon, she planned it, she participated, she was there. Others felt that because she was younger and didn't physically kill anyone, she should be convicted of a lesser charge. The initial vote on Ashley was 8-4 in favor of first-degree murder. But those 4 holdouts created a problem. The verdict had to be unanimous. For 3 days, the jury debated Ashley's culpability. They reviewed her confession multiple times. They looked at the evidence of planning. They discussed her age and Brandon's influence. The turning point came when they reviewed a specific part of Ashley's confession, the part where she admitted locking the front door while her mother was being murdered. That moment convinced the holdouts, Wu said. Ashley had a choice in that moment. She could have unlocked the door and let her mother escape. She could have called 911. She could have grabbed a weapon and tried to stop Brandon. But she didn't. She chose to trap her mother. That's when the holdouts agreed she was guilty of first-degree murder. On the afternoon of April 20, 2020, 3 days after deliberations began, the jury sent a note to Judge Thornton. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as everyone filed back in. The media, the spectators, Thomas and Linda's family members, the attorneys, and finally Brandon and Ashley Hartwell. Both defendants looked terrified. Brandon was pale, his hands shaking. Ashley was crying before the jury even entered. At 3:15 p.m., Judge Thornton took the bench. Has the jury reached a verdict? She asked. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged accountant named David Chin, stood. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdicts. Chin cleared his throat. In the matter of the state of Connecticut versus Brandon Hartwell, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Thomas Hartwell, we the jury find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Brandon's face went white. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Linda Hartwell, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Brandon's head dropped to the table. His shoulders shook with sobs. Thomas and Linda's family members in the gallery were crying. Some with relief, some with continued grief, some with both. Judge Thornton turned to the jury. In the matter of the state of Connecticut versus Ashley Hartwell, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Thomas Hartwell, what is your verdict? Chin's voice was steady. Guilty. Ashley let out a wail. No, please. I didn't, please. Her attorney tried to calm her, but Ashley was inconsolable. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Linda Hartwell, what is your verdict? Guilty. It was over. Both Brandon and Ashley Hartwell had been convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Thornton set a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks later and remanded both defendants to custody without bail. As bailiffs led Brandon and Ashley away, Ashley still screaming, Brandon silent and broken, Thomas and Linda's sister Patricia stood up in the gallery. You got what you deserved, she shouted. You murdered my sister. You murdered my brother-in-law. I hope you rot in hell. Order. Judge Thornton commanded. I understand emotions are high, but I will have order in my courtroom. Patricia sat down, but the damage was done. The raw emotion, the utter devastation this case had caused, was on full display. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Janet Silverman held a press conference. "Justice has been served today," she said. "Thomas and Linda Hartwell can rest in peace knowing that their killers will be held accountable. This verdict sends a clear message. In Connecticut, you cannot murder your parents and escape consequences." She continued, "I want to thank the jury for their service, the investigators for their thorough work, and Thomas and Linda's family for their strength throughout this difficult trial. This has been one of the most challenging cases of my career, and I'm grateful that we were able to deliver the verdict that the evidence demanded." A reporter shouted, "What sentence will you seek?" Silverman's expression hardened. "For Brandon Hartwell, who was 18 at the time of the murders, I will be seeking life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Ashley Hartwell, who was 16, Connecticut law prohibits life without parole for juvenile offenders. But I will be seeking the harshest sentence the law allows, life in prison with the possibility of parole only after serving a minimum of 50 years. Another reporter, "Do you think the verdicts were just?" "Absolutely," Silverman replied without hesitation. "The evidence was overwhelming. The jury made the right decision." The defense attorneys also held brief press conferences. Marcus Holbrook, Brandon's attorney, was somber. "We're disappointed in the verdict, obviously. We believe the jury should have considered lesser charges. But we respect their decision. We'll be exploring all appellate options available to us." Diane Porter, Ashley's attorney, was more emotional. "I'm heartbroken for Ashley. She's a 16-year-old child who will likely spend the rest of her life in prison. That's not justice, that's cruelty. We will absolutely appeal this verdict." The verdict dominated news coverage for days. Legal analysts debated whether justice had been served or whether the sentences would be too harsh. True crime communities online exploded with discussion and debate. Public opinion was divided. Some felt that Brandon and Ashley deserved the harshest possible punishment for murdering their parents. Others felt that treating teenagers, particularly Ashley, as adult murderers was excessive. But the trial wasn't quite over yet. There was still sentencing to come. 6 weeks after the verdict, the Hartwell siblings returned to court for their sentencing hearing. This would be the final chapter in the legal proceedings, the moment when Judge Thornton would decide exactly how long Brandon and Ashley would spend in prison. But before the judge imposed sentences, Connecticut law allowed victims' family members to deliver impact statements, to tell the court how the crimes had affected their lives. Patricia Monroe, Linda's sister and the woman who had taken in Brandon and Ashley after the murders, was the first to speak. She approached the podium slowly, her face drawn with grief and exhaustion. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking, "I don't know how to put into words what these two have taken from me. Linda was my baby sister. We were only 2 years apart. We grew up together, shared everything, knew each other's thoughts before we spoke them. Linda was the kindest person I've ever known. She was pure goodness. She volunteered at soup kitchens. She taught Sunday school. She baked cookies for every kid in the neighborhood. She remembered everyone's birthday. She made everyone feel special." Patricia turned to look directly at Brandon and Ashley, who sat at the defense table with their heads down. "Look at me," Patricia commanded. "Look at me when I'm talking about what you did to my sister." Slowly, reluctantly, both Brandon and Ashley raised their heads. "You murdered her. You, her own children, the babies she carried and birthed and loved more than life itself. You stabbed her 23 times. You watched her bleed. You heard her beg. And you didn't stop. Do you know what Linda's last words were? According to the medical examiner, she was conscious for several minutes. She knew she was dying. She knew her own son was killing her. Can you imagine the betrayal she felt? The heartbreak." Patricia had to pause to collect herself. "Thomas was like a brother to me. He was a good man. A generous man. He worked so hard to give his family a good life. And this is how you repaid him. By murdering him in his own home. I took you in after the murders," Patricia continued, her voice rising. "I comforted you. I believed you. I thought you were grieving victims. I held Ashley while she cried. I told Brandon everything would be okay. And the whole time you were lying to me. You had murdered my sister and brother-in-law, and you looked me in the eye and lied." She turned back to Judge Thornton. "Your Honor, I'm asking you to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. These two don't deserve mercy. They showed no mercy to Thomas and Linda. They don't deserve to ever walk free. They should spend the rest of their lives in prison, thinking every day about what they did." Patricia returned to her seat, sobbing. Next to speak was Michael Reynolds, Thomas's business partner and close friend for 20 years. "Thomas Hartwell was my best friend," Reynolds said simply. "We built a business together. We celebrated our kids' birthdays together. We were there for each other through everything. Thomas told me once that his greatest accomplishment wasn't his business, it was his kids. He said Brandon and Ashley were the best thing he'd ever done. He was so proud of them. He loved them so much. Reynolds looked at Brandon. He loved you. Even when you disappointed him, even when you made mistakes, he loved you. And you killed him for it. I've replayed our last conversation 100 times, Reynolds continued. It was the day before he died. He called me to ask for advice about Brandon's gambling debt. He was trying to figure out how to help his son learn responsibility while still supporting him. He was being a good father. And that night, Brandon murdered him. Reynolds's voice hardened. I don't care about your excuses. I don't care about your psychological evaluations or your troubled childhoods. You were raised with love and privilege. And you threw it all away because you were greedy and selfish. I hope you suffer every day for the rest of your lives. Several more family members and friends spoke, all with similar themes of grief, betrayal, and a desire for maximum punishment. Then it was time for the defendants to speak. Brandon stood first. He'd been given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, to express remorse, to apologize, to say anything that might influence the judge's decision. Your Honor, Brandon began, his voice barely audible, there's nothing I can say that will make this better. There's no apology that's adequate for what I've done. He turned to face Patricia and the other family members. Aunt Patricia, I'm sorry. To everyone who loved my parents, I'm sorry. I took away people you loved. I destroyed families. I caused pain that can never be healed. I think about what I did every single day. Every night, I see my parents' faces. I hear my mom's voice. I replay that night over and over, wishing I could change it. But I can't. I can never take it back. Brandon wiped his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm not the monster the prosecution made me out to be. I'm someone who made the worst possible choices. I'm someone who destroyed his own life along with my parents' lives. I'm someone who will live with this guilt forever. Whatever sentence you give me, Your Honor, it won't be as bad as the sentence I've given myself. I'll never forgive myself. Never. Brandon sat down. His statement had been emotional and seemingly sincere. But it was impossible to know if the remorse was real or performative. One final manipulation in a case built on manipulation. Ashley stood next. She was crying before she even began speaking. I loved my mom, Ashley said, her voice choked with tears. I loved her so much. She was the best mom anyone could ask for. She was kind and patient and supportive. And She couldn't continue for a moment. I can't explain why I did what I did. I can't make sense of it. When I think back to that person who planned those murders, who went along with everything, I don't recognize her. That wasn't me. Or maybe it was me and I'm a terrible person. I don't know anymore. I didn't stab anyone. I know that's not an excuse. I know I'm guilty. But I want everyone to know that when it came time to hurt my mom, I couldn't do it. Because I loved her. I still love her. I'll always love her. Ashley looked at Patricia. Aunt Patricia, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for lying to you. I'm sorry for what I did to your sister. I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could bring them back. I'd give anything, to bring them back. She turned back to Judge Thornton. Whatever you decide, I understand. I deserve to be punished. I just hope that someday, somehow, I can do something to make amends. I know I can never fully make amends for murder. But I want to try. I want to live a life that would make my mom proud, even if I have to do it from prison. Ashley's statement was more sympathetic than Brandon's. She seemed genuinely broken, genuinely remorseful. But again, it was impossible to know if it was genuine or calculated. Now it was Judge Thornton's turn. She would decide Brandon and Ashley Hartwell's fate. Judge Margaret Thornton looked at Brandon and Ashley for a long moment before speaking. Her expression was grave, her posture formal. She'd been a judge for 3 decades, but this was one of the most difficult sentencing decisions she'd ever faced. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell, she began, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury heard all the evidence, deliberated carefully, and determined that you premeditatedly and intentionally murdered your parents, Thomas and Linda Hartwell. Judge Thornton looked down at her notes. In determining an appropriate sentence, I must consider several factors. The nature of the crimes, the impact on victims' families, the defendants' ages and backgrounds, their potential for rehabilitation, and the need to protect society and deliver justice. Let me be clear about the nature of these crimes. This was not a moment of passion. This was not a tragic accident. This was a cold, calculated, premeditated double murder. You spent 6 months planning to kill your parents. You researched methods. You created detailed planning documents. You practiced your route. You purchased supplies. On September 13, 2019, you executed your plan. You left a party, drove to your home, and murdered Thomas and Linda Hartwell in their living room. You inflicted 40 stab wounds between the two victims. You watched them die. You listened to them beg. And you showed no mercy. Judge Thornton's voice rose slightly. After committing these brutal murders, you staged a crime scene to cover your tracks. You disposed of evidence. You cleaned yourselves up. You returned to a party and acted like nothing had happened. You pretended to discover the bodies. You lied to police. You manipulated everyone around you. And you did all of this horror, all of this violence, all of this betrayal, for money. For an inheritance you would have received anyway in just a few years. You were willing to murder the two people who loved you most in the world because you didn't want to wait. Judge Thornton looked directly at Brandon. Brandon Hartwell, you were the primary planner and executor of these murders. You purchased supplies. You did the actual killing. You showed no hesitation and no remorse until after you were caught. Your testimony in this court was self-serving and manipulative. The prosecution has requested life without parole. Given your age at the time, 18 years old, and Connecticut law, I have some discretion in sentencing. She paused, letting the tension build. Brandon Hartwell, I hereby sentence you to life in prison. You will be eligible for parole after serving 60 years. Given your current age, that means you will be 78 years old before you can even apply for parole. And even then, parole is not guaranteed. Brandon showed no visible reaction. He just stared straight ahead, his face blank. Judge Thornton turned to Ashley. Ashley Hartwell, your case is more complicated. You were 16 at the time of the murders, a juvenile. Connecticut law prohibits life without parole for juvenile offenders, and there is extensive case law suggesting that juveniles should be treated differently due to their developing brains and greater capacity for rehabilitation. However, the severity of your crimes cannot be overlooked. You participated in planning these murders for 6 months. You went to your home that night knowing your parents would be killed. And critically, when your mother was being murdered, you locked the door to prevent her escape. That action directly contributed to her death. Ashley was sobbing, her whole body shaking. The defense argues that you were manipulated by your brother, that you froze when it came time to actually commit violence, and that your youth should be considered as a significant mitigating factor. The prosecution argues that you were an active, willing participant who deserves harsh punishment. Judge Thornton paused, her expression stern. After careful consideration, I find that while your brother was the dominant force in planning and executing these murders, you were not merely a passive bystander. You made choices, terrible choices, over the course of 6 months. You had numerous opportunities to stop this plan, to seek help, to save your parents. You chose not to. Ashley Hartwell, I hereby sentence you to life in prison. Given your age at the time of the offense, you will be eligible for parole after serving 40 years. That means you will be 56 years old at your first parole hearing. Ashley let out a wail of anguish. Her attorney put an arm around her shoulders as she collapsed against the table. Judge Thornton continued, her voice cutting through Ashley's sobs. I want to be clear about what parole eligibility means. It does not mean you will be released after 40 years. It means you may apply for parole. Whether you are actually released will depend on your behavior in prison, your participation in rehabilitation programs, your genuine remorse, and the parole board's assessment of whether you pose a danger to society. Both defendants will receive credit for time served since their arrest. In addition, I am ordering both of you to participate in mandatory psychological counseling during your incarceration. You will also be ordered to pay restitution to the victim's estate, though I recognize that such payment is largely symbolic given your circumstances. Judge Thornton looked at both defendants one final time. Brandon and Ashley Hartwell, you committed the ultimate betrayal. You murdered the two people who loved you most in this world. You destroyed not only their lives but the lives of everyone who loved them. You shattered your extended family. You traumatized a community. The sentences I've imposed today are severe as they should be. But no sentence can bring Thomas and Linda Hartwell back. No amount of prison time can undo the pain you've caused. The only thing this court can do is ensure that justice is served and that society is protected from those who would commit such heinous acts. This court is adjourned. As Judge Thornton left the bench, bailiffs moved to escort Brandon and Ashley out of the courtroom. Ashley was still crying uncontrollably, barely able to walk. Brandon moved mechanically, his expression blank as if he'd shut down completely. Patricia Monroe and other family members embraced each other, crying. Whether from relief, grief, or continued pain was impossible to say. Probably all three. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Janet Silverman addressed the media once more. Today justice was served. Brandon Hartwell will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Ashley Hartwell will spend most of her life behind bars. While no sentence can bring Thomas and Linda back, these sentences ensure that their killers will face serious consequences for their actions. A reporter asked, "Do you think 40 years for Ashley is enough?" Silverman nodded. Yes. Given her age at the time and constitutional restrictions on sentencing juveniles, I believe Judge Thornton made the right decision. 40 years is essentially a life sentence for someone convicted at 16. Ashley will be middle-aged before she even has a chance at parole. Another reporter, what message does this case send? It sends the message that parricide, the murder of one's parents, will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, Silverman replied. No matter your age, no matter your circumstances, you cannot murder your parents and escape justice. The defense attorneys were less satisfied with the outcome. Marcus Holbrook, Brandon's attorney, spoke briefly. We're obviously disappointed. We believe the sentence is excessive and amounts to life without parole in practical terms. Brandon will be nearly 80 years old before he's even eligible for parole. We will be filing appeals. Diane Porter, Ashley's attorney, was more emotional. This is a tragedy on top of a tragedy. A 16-year-old girl will spend the next 40 years of her life in prison. Her entire youth, her entire young adulthood, her middle years, all gone. This isn't justice. This is vengeance against a child. The sentencing marked the end of the legal proceedings, but it wasn't the end of the story. The Hartwell case would continue to reverberate through American society for years to come. Brandon Hartwell was transferred to the Osborne Correctional Institution in Somers, Connecticut, a maximum security facility for adult male offenders. At 19 years old, he became one of the youngest inmates serving a de facto life sentence in the Connecticut prison system. Ashley Hartwell was initially sent to York Correctional Institution in Niantic, Connecticut's only facility for female offenders. As a juvenile sentenced as an adult, her case was unique within the prison system. What has life been like for Brandon and Ashley Hartwell behind bars? We know some details from prison records, interviews with corrections officers, and the few journalists who've been granted access to interview them. Brandon's experience has been particularly difficult. Young inmates serving long sentences for violent crimes often face dangers from other prisoners, either from those who view them as threats or from those who target them as vulnerable. According to corrections officers who spoke anonymously to media outlets, Brandon has been involved in several altercations during his incarceration. He's been moved between facilities 3 times for his own safety. He spent significant time in protective custody, essentially solitary confinement, for his protection. Inmates who kill their parents aren't well liked in prison, one officer explained. There's a hierarchy even among criminals, and people who hurt family members, especially parents or children, are at the bottom. Brandon has had a target on his back since day one. Brandon has participated in prison education programs, earning college credits through correspondence courses. He's worked in the prison library. He's attended mandatory counseling sessions, though counselors report that he remains emotionally closed off and defensive. In a rare interview granted to a journalist in 2022, Brandon spoke about his life in prison and his state of mind. Every day is the same, Brandon said, his voice flat and emotionless. You wake up. You go to breakfast. You go to your work assignment or your classes. You go to lunch. You go back to work. You go to dinner. You go back to your cell. You sleep. You do it again the next day. The journalist asked, "Do you think about your parents?" Brandon was quiet for a long time. Every day. Every single day. I see their faces. I hear my mom's voice. I remember things from when I was a kid. Birthdays, vacations, just normal family stuff. And then I remember what I did to them. Do you have regrets? Of course I have regrets. I regret everything. I destroyed my life. I destroyed my sister's life. I destroyed my parents' lives. I destroyed my family. For what? For money I'll never see? For freedom I'll never have? It was all for nothing. When asked if he'd been rehabilitated, Brandon gave a bitter laugh. Rehabilitated? I don't know what that means in this context. I'm not a danger to society anymore. I'll never hurt anyone again. But am I fixed? Can someone who murdered his parents ever be fixed? I don't know. Brandon has been denied parole twice in early review hearings. He won't be eligible for his first real parole hearing until 2079, when he'll be 78 years old. Ashley's experience in prison has been somewhat different. As one of the youngest female inmates in Connecticut's prison system, she's received more attention from rehabilitation programs and mental health services. According to prison psychologist Dr. Sarah Mendez, who spoke on condition of anonymity, Ashley has shown more signs of genuine remorse and rehabilitation than her brother. Ashley participates actively in therapy, Dr. Mendez said. She's worked through significant trauma, not just from committing the murders but from her entire childhood and the trial. She's made real progress in understanding what led to her actions and taking responsibility for them. Ashley has completed her GED and has taken multiple college-level courses. She teaches literacy classes to other inmates. She's become involved in restorative justice programs within the prison. In 2023, Ashley was granted a rare interview with a podcast that focuses on criminal justice reform. Her voice, now more mature at 20 years old, was filled with emotion as she discussed her crimes. "I wish I could talk to my mom one more time," Ashley said. "I wish I could tell her I'm sorry. I wish I could explain that I loved her, I always loved her, and that what I did was so far from who she raised me to be." The interviewer asked, "What would you say to her if you could?" Ashley's voice broke. "I'd say I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'd tell her that not a day goes by that I don't think about her. That I remember all the good times, baking cookies together, her helping me with my homework, her coming to all my cheerleading competitions. She was such a good mom. And I destroyed her. I destroyed us. Do you think you deserve to ever be released from prison?" Ashley was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should spend the rest of my life in prison for what I did. But another part of me, the part that's been working so hard in here to become a better person, hopes that someday I might get a chance to live outside these walls. Not to go back to my old life, that's gone forever. But maybe to do something good. To help other kids who are making bad choices. To prevent someone else from making the mistakes I made. I'll be 56 when I'm eligible for parole. That's so far away it doesn't even feel real. But I'm trying to use this time to become someone my mom would be proud of, even though I know she's not here to see it." Ashley's first parole hearing won't be until 2059. Whether she'll actually be released then depends on numerous factors. Her behavior in prison, her continued participation in rehabilitation, the parole board's assessment, and perhaps most importantly, whether Thomas and Linda's family members believe she's shown genuine rehabilitation. As is standard in any major criminal case, both Brandon and Ashley's legal teams filed appeals following their convictions and sentences. The appeals process would drag on for years, though ultimately, both appeals would be unsuccessful. Brandon's appeal focused on several key arguments. The admission of Ashley's confession should not have been used against Brandon. The defense argued that Ashley's statements implicating Brandon violated his Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses against him, since Ashley didn't testify at trial. The jury selection process was tainted by pretrial publicity. Despite moving the trial to Hartford, the defense argued that media coverage had been so pervasive that finding truly impartial jurors was impossible. The life sentence with 60-year minimum was cruel and unusual punishment for someone who was 18 at the time of the crime, citing recent Supreme Court cases limiting harsh sentences for young offenders. The Connecticut Supreme Court heard oral arguments on Brandon's appeal in 2022. In a 5-2 decision issued in early 2023, the court rejected all of Brandon's arguments and upheld his conviction and sentence. The majority opinion, written by Justice Carolyn Martinez, was scathing. The defendant argues that his youth at the time of the offense should entitle him to a lesser sentence. However, the extensive evidence of premeditation, the brutality of the murders, and the defendant's continued lack of genuine remorse lead this court to conclude that the sentence imposed by the trial court was appropriate and just. The defendant was not a child. He was 18 years old, an adult under Connecticut law. He planned these murders for 6 months. He executed them with cold calculation. He showed no mercy to his victims. The trial court did not abuse its discretion in imposing a sentence that reflects the severity of his crimes. The two dissenting justices argued that sentencing an 18-year-old to effectively die in prison was disproportionate, but they were in the minority. Brandon's federal appeals have similarly been unsuccessful. In 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case, effectively ending his appellate options. Ashley's appeals followed a similar trajectory but with slightly different arguments. Her defense team focused heavily on her age and the question of whether a 16-year-old could truly form the intent necessary for first-degree murder. They also challenged the trial court's decision to try her as an adult, arguing that she should have remained in the juvenile justice system. The Connecticut Supreme Court was more sympathetic to Ashley's arguments than to Brandon's, but ultimately still rejected her appeal. While we recognize that the defendant was only 16 at the time of these crimes, the evidence demonstrates that she was a willing and active participant in planning and executing these murders, Justice Martinez wrote for the majority. The trial court properly considered her age as a mitigating factor in sentencing her to life with parole eligibility after 40 years rather than 60 years. This sentence, while severe, is proportionate to the gravity of her crimes. Ashley's legal team has continued to pursue appeals, including petitions based on new research into adolescent brain development. As of 2025, these appeals are ongoing, though most legal experts believe they will ultimately be unsuccessful. The failed appeals meant that both Brandon and Ashley would remain in prison for the foreseeable future. Their legal options largely exhausted, they would have to focus on what prison life offered them and, eventually, their parole hearings decades in the future. One of the most complex legal issues arising from the Hartwell case involved the question of what would happen to Thomas and Linda's $42 million estate, the very inheritance that had motivated the murders. Connecticut, like most states, has a slayer statute, a law that prevents people from profiting from murders they commit. The logic is simple: you shouldn't be able to kill someone and then inherit their estate. In the Hartwell case, the slayer statute clearly applied to Brandon and Ashley. They were convicted of murdering their parents, which automatically disqualified them from inheriting anything from Thomas and Linda's estate. But this created a complicated question. If Brandon and Ashley couldn't inherit, who would? Thomas and Linda's wills had specified that everything should go to their children. They had no alternate beneficiaries named. They'd never imagined a scenario where their children would murder them and thus be disqualified from inheriting. The estate went into legal limbo for several years while the courts worked out the distribution. Eventually, in 2022, a probate judge ruled that the estate should be distributed according to Connecticut's intestacy laws, the laws that govern estates when there's no valid will. Under these laws, the estate was divided among Thomas and Linda's closest living relatives, their siblings, nieces, nephews, and extended family members. Patricia Monroe, Linda's sister, received a substantial portion of the estate, about $8 million. Thomas's brother, David Hartwell, received a similar amount. The remainder was distributed among more distant relatives. But there was one more twist to this story. Several family members, including Patricia, established a foundation in Thomas and Linda's memory. The Thomas and Linda Hartwell Memorial Foundation was created with $15 million from the estate and dedicated to two causes: providing scholarships to disadvantaged students pursuing business degrees, honoring Thomas's journey from poverty to success, supporting family counseling and intervention programs for troubled teens, with the hope of preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. At the foundation's launch event in 2023, Patricia spoke about why the family had chosen to create it. "Thomas and Linda can't be here, but their legacy can continue," Patricia said, tears in her eyes. "They believed in education. They believed in helping others. They believed in family. This foundation will carry on their values and hopefully prevent other families from experiencing the devastation we've endured." The foundation has since awarded over 200 scholarships and funded dozens of family counseling programs across Connecticut and beyond. It's a bittersweet legacy, good coming from unspeakable tragedy. Brandon and Ashley, meanwhile, will never see a penny of the money that motivated them to commit murder. The irony is profound. They murdered their parents for an inheritance they would never receive, and now spend their lives in prison while distant relatives benefit from the estate they thought would be theirs. Springfield Oaks, Connecticut has slowly recovered from the shock of the Hartwell murders, though the case remains a dark mark on the town's history. The Hartwell house at 847 Maple Ridge Drive sat empty for several years before finally being sold in 2022 to a family from out of state who got it for well below market value. The new owners completely renovated the house, including replacing all the flooring in the living room where the murders occurred. They're aware of the house's history but are trying to create new, positive memories there. Some neighbors still avoid the house. Others have moved away from Maple Ridge Drive entirely, unable to live in a place where such horror occurred. Patricia Monroe continues to grieve for her sister and brother-in-law. She's become an advocate for victims' families and speaks regularly at events for survivors of violent crime. "You never really get over something like this," Patricia said in a recent interview. "You learn to live with it, but the pain doesn't go away. I think about Linda every single day. I imagine the fear she must have felt in those final moments. and it breaks my heart all over again. She refuses to have any contact with Brandon or Ashley and has stated that she will oppose their release at every parole hearing they ever have. They took my sister from me, Patricia said. They don't deserve freedom. They don't deserve forgiveness. They deserve to spend the rest of their lives paying for what they did. The Thomas and Linda Hartwell Memorial Foundation continues to operate and has expanded its mission. It now also funds programs for at-risk youth and families in crisis, with the goal of preventing future tragedies. We can't bring Thomas and Linda back, the Foundation's executive director, Sarah Collins, said at a recent event. But we can honor their memory by helping others. Every scholarship we award, every family we help, that's Thomas and Linda's legacy living on. We've reached the end of this long, difficult story. The story of how two teenagers murdered their parents for an inheritance they would never receive. The story of how greed, pressure, and moral bankruptcy led to unspeakable violence. The story of the trial that shocked America. But what have we learned? What lessons can we take from this horror? Tell me in the comments section. If you made it this far, congratulations, you're officially a DEC detective. Stay tuned for the next one.